Tonight, we're going deep into the 50 darkest Targaryen secrets. This is a topic with a lot to uncover, but I'll keep my narration calm so you can still drift off to sleep. Thank you to those of you who've been joining us consistently. If you're falling asleep with us tonight, let me know in the comments how many nights in a row you've been here. And if this is your first night, just comment night 1. Now back to the video. Long before they ever laid claim to the Iron Throne of Westeros, House Targaryen existed as a minor noble family within the ancient, magical empire of the Valyrian Freehold. They were not the strongest of the 40 Dragonlord families who ruled that glittering, terrible civilization. They were minor players, often overshadowed by grander houses that commanded vast armies of slaves and harnessed the volatile magic of the 14 Flames. Their survival was born not from military might, but from a dark, prophetic vision. In the year 114 BC, a young maiden named Daenys Targaryen, known to history as Daenys the Dreamer, experienced a vivid and terrifying premonition of Valyria's total destruction. Her father, Aenar, believed her. He sold his estates, gathered his family, his wealth, and his 5 dragons, and retreated to the lonely, volcanic island of Dragonstone, on the far edge of the known world. The other Dragon Lords mocked them, viewing their flight as an act of cowardice. But 12 years later, the earth shattered, the volcanoes erupted, and the sky turned to fire. The freehold of Valyria was wiped from the face of the earth in a single afternoon. The Targaryens were left as the sole masters of dragons, their survival forever altering the course of history. This miraculous escape fostered a dangerous, divine right mentality within the family. They came to believe that their blood was fundamentally different from that of ordinary mortals, a belief symbolized by their silver-gold hair, violet eyes, and high resistance to heat and disease. To preserve this magical bloodline and maintain their unique connection to dragons, the Targaryens adopted the ancient Valyrian practice of sibling marriage. While this kept their power concentrated, it also introduced a tragic instability into their lineage. For nearly 300 years, the realm would whisper that whenever a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin to decide whether they will be great or mad. This genetic isolation created a fragile dynasty, where brilliant conquerors and gentle peacemakers shared the same blood as sadistic tyrants and paranoid zealots. The very conquest of Westeros by Aegon I was not merely driven by a desire for power, but by a secret, heavy burden. Aegon's motivation was rooted in a prophetic dream he called the Song of Ice and Fire. He foresaw a terrible darkness coming from the north, a winter that would destroy the world of the living. Aegon believed that only a united Westeros, ruled by a Targaryen king with dragons, could stand against this looming threat. This secret prophecy was passed down from monarch to heir, justifying centuries of absolute rule, bloody conquests, and the suppression of local lords. Yet this noble intent often twisted into obsession, leading to catastrophic internal conflicts like the Dance of the Dragons, a brutal civil war that pitted brother against sister and dragon against dragon, ultimately leading to the tragic extinction of the very beasts that gave them their power in the year 153 AC. Without their dragons, the Targaryens were forced to rely on fear, ancient secrets, and increasingly desperate measures to maintain their hold on the Iron Throne, culminating in the madness of Aerys II and the violent collapse of their 3-century dynasty. Despite their eventual dominance over an entire continent, House Targaryen began as the afterthought of a dying empire. In the ancient Valyrian Freehold, 40 Dragonlord families competed for supremacy, but the Targaryens were never counted among the great. They were regarded as minor, their dragons smaller, their wealth unremarkable, their political influence in the capital all but non-existent. This low status was a quiet humiliation. While other families commanded vast armies of slaves and held seats on the high councils, the Targaryens lingered on the margins, struggling to secure even a modest foothold in the glittering tyranny of Valyria. Their survival depended not on strength of arms, but on something far more unpredictable. A strange gift for seeing what others could not. When Daenys the Dreamer received her terrifying vision of the doom, her father Aenar chose to believe her. He sold their estates, gathered their dragons, and fled to the lonely volcanic island of Dragonstone, the outermost edge of the known Valyrian world. The other Dragonlord families mocked this retreat as cowardice, a disgraceful abandonment of duty and ambition. But on Dragonstone, isolated from the political heart of the Freehold, the Targaryens were free to practice what the capital forbade. Whispers followed them even in exile. They were said to perform forbidden rites, to delve into blood magic and sorcery in an attempt to compensate for their lack of influence. In the caverns beneath the Dragonmont, under the cover of volcanic steam and perpetual twilight, they sought darker methods to strengthen their bond with dragons, methods that would have been condemned by the priestly orders of Valyria. These were the acts of a family backed into a corner, willing to court damnation for any edge. The rumors were never fully confirmed, but they persisted, a stain of suspicion that clung to the Targaryen name. And then the doom came. The earth shattered, the 14 flames erupted, and the entire Freehold was consumed in a single afternoon. The great families, the proud lords of dragon and slave, were wiped from existence. Only the outcasts on Dragonstone survived, their isolation becoming their salvation. They emerged as the last Dragonlords in the world, but the memory of their lowly status never truly faded. They had been scorned, driven to the edge, forced to embrace forbidden knowledge. That scar shaped their dynasty, creating a hunger for validation that would burn across generations. It drove their conquest of Westeros, their obsession with purity, and their unshakable belief that they were chosen by fate. All of it, the prophecies, the incest, the blood-soaked ambition, traced back to that original wound, the shame of being the least among equals, and the desperate will to never be lesser again. For more than 100 years after the Doom, during the chaotic era known as the Century of Blood, the Targaryens did not look west to conquer, nor did they try to rebuild the empire they had left behind. They watched from their volcanic stronghold as the free cities tore themselves apart, fighting over the scraps of Valyria. Volantis begged them to join the struggle, to bring their dragons and claim their rightful place as the heirs to the Freehold. But the Targaryens refused. Perhaps they knew that trying to resurrect the past was a fool's errand, or perhaps they were still haunted by the ghosts of their former insignificance. They chose instead to bide their time, letting the old world bleed itself dry, while they quietly consolidated their strength. It was not until the rise of Aegon, the first of his name, that this passive isolation transformed into a terrifying, active ambition. Aegon did not look back toward the smoking ruins of the east. His gaze was fixed firmly on the sunset lands of Westeros, a fractured continent divided into 7 warring kingdoms. To the kings of Westeros, Dragonstone was merely a bleak rock, inhabited by eccentric foreigners who played with lizards. They did not see the storm gathering on their horizon. Aegon, alongside his sister wives Visenya and Rhaenys, possessed something the petty kings of the mainland could never hope to match: 3 fully grown dragons, including Balerion the Black Dread, a beast so massive his shadow could swallow entire towns. But more than raw power, the siblings possessed a singular, unifying vision. They would not be just another house competing for a crown. They would be the sole arbiters of a new world order. The painted table, carved in the image of Westeros without borders, was not just a map for military planning. It was a declaration of absolute ownership. When Aegon finally launched his conquest with fewer than 3,000 men, the lords of Westeros laughed. They believed numbers and high stone walls would protect them. They were wrong. The Field of Fire, where 3 dragons were unleashed simultaneously for the first and only time in history, burned away any illusion of resistance. In a single day, 4,000 men were consumed by dragonflame, and the ancient line of House Gardner was extinguished forever. The conquest was not merely about land or wealth, it was the ultimate correction of history. By forging the Iron Throne from the melted swords of their defeated enemies, the Targaryens created a monument to their own supremacy. They elevated themselves from the minor nobles of a dead empire to the living gods of a new continent. The shame of Valyria was finally washed away in blood and fire, replaced by a myth of divine right that would endure for nearly 300 years. So House Targaryen was an outcast among the 40 Dragonlord families of the Valyrian Freehold. They were not the richest, not the most powerful, and certainly not the most respected. They were pushed to the absolute fringe of the known world, physically isolated on their wind-swept outpost of Dragonstone. But it is precisely from the edge of the world that history often turns. And the history of this entire house turns on a single, very specific point. It all started with a dream. There was a girl named Daenys Targaryen, the daughter of Lord Aenar. Around 114 years before Aegon the Conqueror would set foot on the shores of Westeros, this young girl began to have nightmares. Not the anxious dreams of a sheltered noble girl worried about marriage or status. Something far darker began to take root in her sleep. She saw Valyria, not the gleaming capital of civilization she knew in waking life, but a land caught in its own death throes. The specific details are handed down through the generations of her family. She saw the 14 flames, the volcanoes that powered the Empire's entire society, its magic, its industry, its very soul. In her dreams, they were not just active, they were tearing the peninsula apart from beneath. The mountains did not just erupt, they exploded. The skies turned black with ash, blotting out the sun for years to come. Dragons, the mightiest creatures the world had ever seen, burned alive in the sky as the very ground they ruled dissolved into the churning sea. She saw palaces of stone turn to rivers of fire. She heard the screaming of 1,000,000 souls. It was not a natural disaster, it was a total fiery annihilation. The doom of Valyria, written in a dream long before a single stone of it ever fell from the sky. Daenys woke from this nightmare, and she went straight to her father. Lord Aenar Targaryen listened. He did not dismiss her as a hysterical child. He did not call for the maesters. He did what no other dragon lord in the entire history of the Freehold would ever dream of doing. He chose to believe her completely. He made a decision that, in the long run, would save only his bloodline and doom every other. He began to liquidate the Targaryen holdings in Valyria, the estates, the vast treasuries, the thousands of slaves, the ancestral lands that had belonged to their family for generations. All of it had to go. He packed up his dragons, his household, his warriors, and his library, and he moved everything that could be moved across the narrow sea to Dragonstone. The rival houses of the Freehold watched this frantic exodus unfold, and they laughed. To the great families of Valyria, this was the most visible act of supreme cowardice they had ever witnessed. Lord Aenar Targaryen, the head of the weakest of the 40 families, frightened out of his wits by a little girl's nightmare, running away from the most powerful civilization the world had ever known. The whispers followed them across the water. The Targaryens are weak. They quit. They fled. They were not even worth conquering. Let them rot on their lonely rock. But Daenys did not simply speak of her dream. She was meticulous. She recorded every last detail of her prophetic visions. She wrote them down in a book, a manuscript that she herself titled. This book became the single most important artifact in the early history of House Targaryen. It was the physical proof that they were right. It was the justification, the written law, that allowed Lord Aenar to abandon his entire civilization. Without this book, his decision was just paranoia. With it, he had a prophecy. And this brings us to one of the darkest secrets in the entire Targaryen saga. The book itself is gone, entirely lost. It vanished from the libraries of Dragonstone and eventually from the royal archives in King's Landing. No one knows exactly when it disappeared or who took it. Some say it was burned in the great fire that consumed the Red Keep during the cruel reign of Maegor the Cruel. Others whisper it was stolen by a maester of the Citadel who was trying to systematically destroy Targaryen mysticism and replace it with rational history. Or perhaps, most troubling of all, it was deliberately hidden by a Targaryen king who read its contents and feared what it actually predicted for the future of his family. Whatever the cause of its disappearance, no longer physically exists in the world of the story. We know it was real because later Targaryens, from Aegon the Conqueror himself to Jaehaerys the Conciliator, all quoted directly from it. But we cannot read her original words. The direct link to that specific prophecy is broken. This loss created a profound psychological scar on the dynasty. Without the original text sitting on a shelf for reference, every Targaryen born after the Doom had to rely on the second-hand memory of what Daenys dreamed. And memory is a fragile and dangerous thing. Memory can be shaped by ambition. Memory can be bent by fear. Memory can be stretched to justify a war, a conquest, or a terrible marriage that no one wanted. The Targaryens were saved by a prophecy, but they were haunted by its absence. They spent the next 300 years searching for meaning, searching for signs, searching for a destiny in a book that no longer existed. This hunger for a greater destiny, this certainty that they were chosen, would drive them to conquer an entire continent. It turned a family of outcasts into a dynasty of conquerors. But the empty space where once sat was never truly filled. It became a hungry vacuum of expectation. And into that vacuum, the Targaryens poured their own ambitions, their own fears, their own paranoia, and their own justifications for the fire and blood that was destined to follow. Aenar Targaryen gathered his family, his 5 dragons, and everything he could carry from his estates in the Valyrian Freehold. He abandoned the greatest civilization the world had ever known for a bleak, volcanic rock in the narrow sea. It was the year 114 before the conquest, and the eyes of every dragonlord in the Freehold were fixed on him, not in fear, but in contempt. They called him a coward. They said he was running from shadows. Dragonstone itself was a fortress born of those shadows. The island sat beneath a perpetual haze of ash and steam, its black cliffs rising sheer from a churning grey sea. It was not a place of fertile fields or gentle harbours. It was a place of earth and fire, a grim and active volcano. The family did not merely build a castle here. They forged one, using the lost arts of their homeland. The castle walls are not cut and stacked like the fortresses of Westeros. They are fused, melted and shaped by dragon flame and sorcery into a single, seamless mass of dark stone. The keep is a great round tower, known as the Stone Drum. The walls are lined with gargoyles, dragons and grotesques, their wings and claws intertwining in patterns that seem almost organic. It was established in that very year, 114 before the conquest, as a fortress against an entire world that had laughed at them. But there is a rumor that has persisted for centuries, a whisper that clings to the fused stone of the castle, just as stubbornly as the sea mist. Valyrian magic, especially the magic of shaping stone, is said to require a steep price: blood. The Dragonlords were not squeamish about blood sacrifice. When you look at the perfect, unnatural curves of Dragonstone, at the way the towers seem to grow out of the rock itself, it is hard not to wonder what was required to fuse it. What voice, or what life, was poured into the foundations to make the castle stand defiant against the storm. It is a grim thought that follows you through every shadowed corridor of the fortress. For 12 years, the Targaryens remained there, lords of a single black rock. They watched the world from a distance. They could see the smoke from the constant volcanic activity of their own home, a constant reminder of the volatile power they now lived on top of. Then, in 102 before the conquest, the doom came. In a single day, the Valyrian peninsula shattered, the 14 flames erupted, the land cracked open and sank into the sea. From the high towers of their island refuge, the Targaryen family watched the sky turn red, They watched the smoke plume rise so high that it blotted out the sun for years. They were completely isolated. The Freehold, the civilization that had shunned them, the people who had called them cowards, was screaming its last breath in a cataclysm of fire and magic. They were safe, but they were never the same. No one could watch the entire world they knew burn to ash and remain untouched. They were the last Dragon Lords, the survivors, and survival, when everyone else is dead, carries a very heavy price. The world was now theirs by default. The Valyrian Freehold was gone. The great power vacuum in Essos was filled with chaos and warlords. The 7 kingdoms of Westeros, across the narrow sea, were fracturing and bleeding in their own petty wars. And on Dragonstone, the Targaryens sat in their fused stone halls, surrounded by the last dragons in the known world. They had survived the end of everything. Now they had to decide what came next. The prophecy of Daenys the Dreamer had spared them. They had seen the limits of the old world. The idea of simply ruling a grim, isolated rock in the shadow of a dead civilization no longer seemed enough. The dragon has 3 heads, but it must have a nest. For more than a century, they bided their time. Generations of Targaryens lived and died on that volcanic island, looking out over the water, learning the currents of the narrow sea, and breeding their beasts. The dragons Balerion, Vhagar, and Meraxes grew massive in the shadow of the Dragonmont, their wings casting shadows over the black waves. Then came Aegon. He was not content to be the lord of a barren rock, a mere relic of a dead empire. He looked west, toward the fractured continent of Westeros, where 7 kings fought endless, bloody wars, for borders that shifted with every passing season. In the great hall of Dragonstone, Aegon commissioned a massive table, carved from a single block of wood, detailed with the bays, rivers, mountains, and castles of the continent he intended to claim. It had no borders, for Aegon believed the land should be one. With his sister wives, Visenya and Rhaenys, and their 3 mighty dragons, he would turn his gaze from the ashes of the past to the conquest of the future. The era of the Dragon Lords was not over. It was simply moving to a new home. The Black Stone of Dragonstone is a monument to Valyrian exile. It was built by a family that had abandoned the greatest civilization in history, isolated on a volcanic island at the edge of the world. The architecture is fused solid, a dark fortress shaped by spells and perhaps by blood, raised in the year 114 before the conquest. The other Dragonlord houses laughed at the Targaryens. They called Aenar a coward for selling his holdings and fleeing. They did not know that his daughter Daenys had seen a vision. She had seen the 14 flames turn against their masters. She had seen the peninsula of Valyria collapse into a boiling sea. For 12 years, the Targaryens waited on Dragonstone. They built their fortress, they raised their dragons, and they watched the horizon. Then the horizon erupted. The doom of Valyria was not a gradual collapse. The Freehold did not fall to a slow decline or a war of succession. It was extinguished in a single day of apocalyptic volcanic fury. The 14 flames exploded simultaneously. The entire Valyrian peninsula shattered into 1,000 pieces, creating the smoking sea. The sea rushed in, only to flash into steam against the molten rock. The greatest city in the world, the heart of a civilization that had lasted 5,000 years, was reduced to rubble and steam in the time it took to draw a breath. Rocks the size of castles were thrown into the air. The land did not sink, it exploded. The magic of the Valyrian world collapsed in on itself. From Dragonstone, it must have looked like the end of the world. The sky burned red for days. The ground trembled. Ash fell like grey snow over the narrow sea. The Targaryens knew that they were now the last Dragon Lords on Earth. Every other house that had mocked them was gone, but they were not the only survivors. A few Dragon Lords had been away from the peninsula when the doom struck. House Baleris, House Vumabar, House Hargars. They had been on business in the colonies, or returning from distant wars. When the news of the doom reached them, they did not flee further west. They turned back. They commanded fleets that could conquer empires. They rode dragons that had been bred for war for thousands of years. They sailed straight into the smoking sea, determined to reclaim the treasures and the power of their ancestors. They flew into the heart of the disaster, their dragons struggling against winds thick with ash and poison. They were searching for answers, for survivors, for a way to rebuild. Not a single one returned. They vanished without a trace, swallowed by the twisted magics that still haunted the ruins of the Freehold. The fate of those rival lords remains one of the great, terrifying mysteries of history. The smoking sea gave them nothing but a slow, silent disappearance. Some say their souls still wander the ruins, trapped in a loop of fire and failure. This singular survival is why the darkest speculation about the Targaryens exists. They did not just escape the doom, they escaped it with their power intact. The possession of knowledge is a dark legacy. Some historians whisper that Daenys the Dreamer foresaw not just the fire, but the trigger. She saw the blood magic rituals and the overmining of the 14 flames that destabilized the peninsula. She saw the experiments. She saw the sacrifices growing larger. She saw the earth cracking under the strain of the fireworms. The Targaryens left because they saw exactly what was coming, and they understood exactly why it was coming. It means the Targaryens watched the destruction unfold, not with surprise, but with grim certainty. They knew the world of their ancestors was dying because it had been corrupted from within. They took that understanding with them to Dragonstone. They knew what could be done with fire and blood. They knew what had destroyed the greatest civilization in history. And they took those secrets to their new home, to their black stone fortress, where they waited for the world to forget. When the ash finally settled, the Targaryens were alone. They were the single remaining house of dragon lords in all of history. The world of their ancestors lay in ruins beneath a poisoned sea. Their island fortress was no longer a place of exile. It was the last seat of true power in the known world. The Targaryens looked west, past the narrow sea, toward a continent that had spent thousands of years in the shadow of Valyrian power. The shadow was gone. The great empire that had held the world in check was nothing but ash. The kingdoms of Westeros were wealthy, divided, and vulnerable. The Targaryens had the keys to the cage, and the only dragons in the world. They had a century to wait. And when they were ready, they brought the fire and blood of the Doom, that had never known what true power looked like. When the Doom fell on Valyria, the 14 flames devoured an empire in a single day. The cities melted, the dragon lords burned, and the very sky turned to ash. But the horror did not end there. On the fringes of that fallen civilization, on an island that had been deliberately isolated from the rest of the Freehold, a different kind of darkness had been cultivated for centuries. That island was Gogossos, known to the world as the Isle of Serpents, and its legacy would outlast the empire that created it. Gogossos was not a seat of delicate art or noble governance. It was a penal colony and a laboratory. The climate was a humid, treacherous fever dream of swamps and jungle, where the air itself seemed to rot. But the true corruption did not come from the land. It came from the blood mages, who had claimed the island as their own private domain. Here, the Valyrians had forsaken the pursuit of knowledge and embraced the darkest violations of the natural order. The horrific Valyrian practice of breeding beasts with human slaves using dark blood magic was not a secret kept from the 40 families. It was an industry funded by them, an obscene art form perfected on the operating tables of Gogossos. They created chimeras. Flesh was fused with flesh. A man could be bound to a serpent, forced to live as a scaled and venomous hybrid. A beast could be gifted with the cunning of a slave. They were trying to build a bridge between species, to bind the soul of a man to the body of a monster, and they did not care how many lives it cost to get the formula right. Now, the question that never answers cleanly is this: how deeply were the Targaryens involved? The official histories record that House Targaryen was among the great Dragon Lord families, but they were never the most powerful. Some scholars believe this lower status was a matter of principle. a refusal to participate in the deepest evils of the Freehold. But the evidence suggests a far more uncomfortable truth. Implied Targaryen involvement in these unnatural genetic experiments before their flight from the Freehold is a dark thread that runs directly through their own origin story. How else did they achieve their bond with dragons? The binding of a family to a species of living weapons was not a gift of nature. It was a magical working, a process of control and fusion that looked suspiciously similar to the methods used in the Gogossos pits. The Targaryen library on Dragonstone contained texts on blood magic so forbidden that even the maesters of the Citadel were forbidden from reading them. Aerea Targaryen and his daughter Daenys the Dreamer did not simply see the doom. They saw what their family had become complicit in. The flight to Dragonstone was not a simple act of survival. It was a desperate severing, a rejection of a culture that had grown so monstrous it could no longer be saved. But a rejection is not an absolution. The blood of Gogossos flowed in their veins. The lingering genetic anomalies that occasionally manifest in Targaryen stillbirths throughout history are the precise biological evidence of that poisoned inheritance. The family archives are filled with the accounts of children who were born too wrong to survive. Queen Rhaenys, the sister wife of Aegon the Conqueror, was known for her fertility, but her pregnancies were plagued by tragedy. The children she lost were not simply stillborn. Records from the Maesters describe deformities that were unnatural: a tail, a cleft that suggested wings, scales upon the skin. Maegor the Cruel, the son of Aegon and Visenya, was desperate to produce an heir, yet every child born to his wives was a horror. One was described as a worm with a woman's face, another was covered in scales and born dead with its eyes open. Rhaenyra Targaryen, the realm's delight, experienced her own share of this darkness. The stillbirth she suffered in her early 20s was said to be a monstrous thing, creature of cracked skin and twisted limbs that bore no resemblance to a healthy child. These are not the ordinary tragedies of a medieval dynasty. They are the direct consequence of a bloodline that had been magically engineered and then left to rot. The experiments of Gogossos were an attempt to perfect humanity by fusing it with beast, but the perfection never came. Instead, they shattered the natural stability of the human genome, creating a hereditary instability that would express itself in every generation of the Targaryen family. The birth of a dragon required fire and blood, but it also required a sacrifice of normalcy that could never be repaid. After the doom, Gogossos was left to its own devices. The colony rebelled against its masters. The slaves rose up, tearing the Valyrian overseers limb from limb, but they could not destroy the foundations of the blood magic. The island became a cursed place, a stain on the maps that sailors would avoid at all costs. The grayscale plague, the disease that turns living flesh into hard, dead stone, is widely believed by maesters to have originated on Gogossos, a final, terrible bioweapon that escaped the ruins of the laboratory. The infection would spread across the known world, slaughtering thousands, a ghost of the Chimera experiments that refused to die. For the Targaryens, Gogossos was a mirror. They looked at it, and they saw the worst possible version of their own future. They had fled the fire, but they had not fled the curse. This corrupted inheritance, this mingled gift of prophetic dreams and monstrous births, was the foundation upon which they would build their kingdom in Westeros. The castle of Dragonstone was not a clean slate. It was carved from the same black volcanic stone that had witnessed the atrocities of the Freehold. The first Targaryen king did not step out of the shadow of Valyria onto a bright new world. He stepped out of one nightmare and into another, carrying the ancient debt of Gogossos in his blood. And the dynasty of fire and blood was born, not from purity, but from a desperate, flawed escape that would define every king and queen to follow. While the blood magic of Gogossos twisted flesh into monstrous forms, the dragon lords of old Valyria were perfecting a far more targeted kind of enslavement. The dragon horn, not simply an instrument of war, but a tool of absolute magical subjugation. Massive curving horns, banded in Valyrian steel and red gold, their surfaces etched with tightly wound spells that predated the Doom itself. These were the Dragonbinders. Their purpose was not the subtle bond between a hatchling and its rider. These were instruments of raw conquest. They were designed to steal, control, and dominate a fully grown dragon against its will, to take the power of an ancient beast and place it entirely in the hands of the one who sounded the horn. But the magic demanded a price, and that price was the blower's own life. The horn could only be sounded by a mortal who accepted the fire. The moment the breath entered the horn, the spell ignited the air in the blower's lungs. The flesh burned, the throat blackened, and the blood turned to steam. The blower always died. Their lungs were charred from the inside out. The magic was a one-way contract, sealed with a human life, a sacrifice poured directly into the horn's demand for fire and blood. The most infamous example of this magic survived the Doom. In the books, it is known simply as Dragonbinder, a horn of blackest obsidian, bound in pale gold and Valyrian steel. It is said to emit a low hum of heat even when cold, and the bands of metal are so tightly etched with high Valyrian glyphs that they seem to writhe like living worms of fire. The message inscribed on the horn is brutally straightforward. I am Dragonbinder. No mortal man shall sound me and live. This is not a warning. It is a product description. The horn is a weapon that consumes its own trigger, yet men still blow it, because the reward is absolute mastery over a creature of living flame. The one who sounds the horn owns the dragon. The previous bond is burned away. The beast accepts its new master, a master who has proven they have the power to spend a life to claim the fire. This raises a strange question for the history of Westeros. If the mightiest dragon lords possessed these ultimate failsafes for dragon control, why did the Targaryens never resort to them when they established their kingdom in the Seven Kingdoms? The answer lies in the difference between control and bonding. The horns were a master's whip, a tool to break a strange and hostile creature to one's will. The Targaryens had something better. They had the inherited Valyrian bloodline. From the moment a dragon egg was placed in a cradle, a connection was forged. The dragon recognized the blood. It was raised within the family, a deep instinctive bond that did not require a death-like magical lash to enforce. The Targaryens did not need to burn a man alive simply to claim a dragon, because the dragon already recognized their fire. Aegon the Conqueror did not need a charred corpse to claim Balerion the Black Dread. He had the blood of old Valyria in his veins. Instead of a weapon that demanded a final scream, they cultivated a dynasty of riders through birth, marriage, and the careful management of their intimate family line. The horns were a weapon of desperate men, or of usurpers who lacked the ancient blood. They represent the brutal mechanical version of what the Targaryens possessed naturally. For the Targaryens, the bond was a promise of heritage. For the Freehold, the horn was a threat of conquest. This natural bond was the secret to their power over the Seven Kingdoms. It was why no usurper could simply find a horn and take a dragon from them. No matter how many men they burned alive, the dragons knew their own. It was a system built on dynasty, not on disposable sacrifice. But having the bloodline was not a guaranteed peace. It simply moved the violence from the lungs of the horn, blower into the heart of the family itself. The physical horns were a relic of a time when Valyria commanded the world with an iron fist made of fire, flesh, and searing magic. For the Targaryens of Dragonstone, the bond was an inheritance, but inheritance can be lost, diluted, and broken when they could not create new bonds fast enough, or when a dragon died without an heir. The weakness of their inherent system became terrifyingly clear. The descent into desperation began. They could not simply forge a new dragon. They could not burn a stranger alive and demand a new beast arrive from the smoking ruins. The horns were useless to them without the wild magic of the Freehold to supply the creature on the other end of the bond. The current they relied on most, the dragon blood inside their own veins, was beginning to run thin. When the last dragons grew sickly, stunted and finally stopped breathing fire, the Targaryens were left surrounded by stone eggs that would never hatch and a bloodline that could no longer remember how to command the sky. The Dragonbinder horns were a desperate attempt to control the uncontrollable, to bind a creature of living fire to the will of a fragile human frame. But the most obsessive and destructive form of control the Targaryens ever exercised was not over their dragons. It was over themselves, over their own flesh and blood. This is the legacy of the Incestuous Shield, a practice so deeply woven into the fabric of the dynasty that it became both its defining strength and the slow poison that would unravel its sanity. To understand the extremes the family went to, you have to understand what they believed they were protecting. The Dragon Riders of Old Valyria were not merely a royal family, they were a separate species of power. The ability to bond with a dragon was not a skill that could be taught. It was a fire in the blood, a genetic inheritance passed from parent to child. If a Targaryen married a non-Targaryen, that fire was diluted. The dragon eggs might not hatch, the bond would weaken, the magic of their ancestors would silently fade. So they made a terrible choice. They closed the family circle. Brothers married sisters. Uncles married nieces. Cousins married cousins. The family tree of House Targaryen is not a tree at all. It is a knot, a snarl of overlapping branches that twist back upon themselves, strangling the life out of the very centre. Over the centuries, this created a strange and frightening pattern. The Targaryens became a house of extremes. They produced some of the most brilliant, ambitious, and visionary rulers in Westeros. Aegon the Conqueror, Jaehaerys the Conciliator, Daeron the Good, but they also produced the Mad King, Aerion Brightflame, and a dozen other minds that cracked under the weight of their own blood. The Maesters have a phrase for this. They say that when a Targaryen is born, the gods flip a coin. One side, greatness, the other side, madness. But it was not the gods who flipped that coin. It was the family itself, generation after generation, forcing the same two faces together until the genetic deck was stacked entirely against them. The madness was not a mystery. It was a mathematical certainty. When you marry a brother to a sister, you do not simply preserve the good traits. You preserve the recessive flaws, the hidden weaknesses, the ancient nightmares buried deep in the bloodline. And the more you close the circle, the louder those nightmares become. Aerys II, the Mad King, was the final result of 3 centuries of this practice. His paranoia, his obsession with fire, his belief that everyone was a traitor, these were not random afflictions. They were the psychological collapse of a mind trapped inside a genetic cage that his ancestors had spent generations building. But there is an even darker secret hidden beneath this practice, a truth that the family chroniclers tried very hard to keep obscured. Not every child born to a Targaryen sibling pair was simply a coin flip between greatness or madness. Some children were born with bodies that could not survive, or minds that could not form properly. When the bloodlines grew too tight, these outcomes were an inevitability. The Targaryen lineage is full of strange holes. A prince is born here, a princess is named there, and then there is silence. No mention of their death, no mention of their illness. They simply vanish from the chronicles, cut out of the family tree, as if they were never grafted onto it. What happened to those children? The records do not say. Whispers from the court suggest that crippled or profoundly simple children were quietly set aside. They were removed from the public eye, given to distant relatives or religious orders, their names struck from the official histories. The Targaryens understood that their power relied entirely on their image. They were the blood of the dragon, divine, untouchable, perfect. A child born with a twisted spine or a fragile mind could not exist within that myth. It would break the spell, and the spell was everything. So they purged the evidence. They hid the failures. They kept the bloodline clean by erasing the parts of it that proved the blood was just as fragile as any other. This was the Incestuous Shield, a wall built to protect the dragon blood from the outside world. But every wall has a cost, and the cost of this shield was the family's collective sanity, their humanity, and the lives of their own most vulnerable infants. By the time the dragons themselves began to dwindle and die, the family was already broken from the inside. The shield had become a prison. The blood was pure, but it was also toxic. The Targaryens did not simply breed a dynasty. They bred a line so tight that it became brittle, prone to shattering under the slightest pressure. The great disaster that would finally break them was not a random betrayal or an outside invasion. It was a genetic inevitability. The fire was already burning too hot inside the cage, and the cage was already too small to contain it. We know the cost of the incest: madness, stillbirths, cruelty beyond reason. But history suggests the Targaryens did not keep their blood pure out of simple arrogance or tradition. They did it because they believed they were not fully human. They believed they carried something else inside them, something that could only be passed on through the blood, something that connected them directly to the dragons they rode. The bond between a Targaryen and their dragon was not merely one of master and beast. It was a physiological calling. The stories speak of their heat resistance, their ability to walk through flames that would kill any ordinary man. Daenerys Targaryen walked into a funeral pyre and emerged unburnt. Her brother Viserys was killed by molten gold, but the Targaryen flesh itself seemed to resist the fire. To the Maesters of Westeros, these were just exotic traits of a distant, foreign family. But to those who study the deepest secrets of Valyria, the connection suggests something far more disturbing. The dragons had been literally bred into the Targaryen line. The bond of dragon and rider is almost telepathic. They share dreams, they share hunger, they share a consciousness. Daenys the Dreamer foresaw the doom of Valyria. This suggests a hybrid nature, a mingling of bloodlines that began long before they ever set foot on Dragonstone. The architecture of Dragonstone itself, fused stone shaped by stone singing, hints at their blood. If a dragon lord could shape stone with his voice, what else had the Valyrian sorcerers shaped within their own children? If the Targaryens carried the essence of a dragon within their veins, does that essence survive death? History records a strange phenomenon surrounding the corpses of the dragon lords. Maester Aemon, one of the most learned men of the century, is said to have burned with a strange low fever even in his oldest years, as if the fire inside him was stoked by a dying ember. When he died, his body was cremated, as is the custom of the Night's Watch. But those who tended to him in his final hours noted that the warmth of his skin never seemed to fade, not fully, as if the fire had retreated deeper inside to wait for the pyre. There are other accounts, whispers carried by the silent sisters who prepare the dead, Targaryen corpses that did not bloat or rot in the usual manner. They shriveled, they dried from the inside. The bodies seemed to smoulder in their graves as if a dragon's pilot light still flickered deep within the bones. It was a gruesome sign that the dragon in the blood had a life of its own. A child of the Wyrm in the flesh does not easily surrender to the cold of the earth. This leads to the darkest theory surrounding the Targaryens, a theory that stalks the edges of accepted history. It is the claim that the Targaryens and all the dragon lords of Valyria were not born, but made. Blood magic, hybridization, the same horrific experiments performed in the jungles of Gogossos, the chimeric experiments that bred beasts with human slaves, were not mere diversions for the Valyrian mages. They were the very factory line of the Freehold's nobility. The theory suggests that the Valyrians, in their desperate hunger for power, could not simply find a dragon to ride. They had to become dragons themselves. They took the blood of wyverns and dragons, mixed it with human slaves, and then forced their own noble houses to interbreed with these results over centuries. The Dragon Lords are the end product of generations of calculated sorcery. It is a theory that explains the madness. It explains the stillbirths with monstrous features, covered in scales or with wings, that litter the historical records. It explains the desperate need to keep the blood pure. If you dilute the blood, you lose the magic. You cease to be a dragon. You become just a man. This explains the madness of Aerean Brightflame, who drank Wildfire, believing he would turn into a dragon. He believed the myth of his own flesh so deeply he killed himself trying to prove it. The Dragon Lords of Valyria were not just slave masters and sorcerers. They were a separate species, or, at the very least, they were so convinced of it that they built their entire civilization on the premise. If the Targaryens were indeed a creation of blood and sorcery, a breed apart, then their eventual decline makes a terrible kind of sense. The magic sustaining them was always finite. It required constant renewal, new dragons, new eggs, new blood sacrifices hidden behind palace walls. When the dragons died, a part of the Targaryens died with them. The magic that animated their flesh, that gave them the heat of life, began to cool, and with the magic fading, the dynasty was left with only its human qualities. And as history would show, their humanity was the most flawed part of them. The desire to reclaim the fire, to feel the heat of the dragon once more, would drive the later kings to acts of paranoia and cruelty that the first Valyrian sorcerers could never have predicted. It would lead them to experiments of their own, the desperate grasps at power that would ultimately consume them from within, much like the internal fire that took their ancestors on their funeral pyres. The fire that burned in Targaryen blood did not simply keep them warm or bond them to dragons. It did something stranger. It opened a channel into time itself. The dragon dreams were never simple nightmares. They were visions of futures that had not yet happened. Aegon the Conqueror, the one who built the Iron Throne, had a dream that defined the entire purpose of his dynasty. He saw a shadow falling across the world from the far north, a winter without end populated by a foe of impossible cold. He named this vision the Song of Ice and Fire, and he built a kingdom to stand against it. The conquest of the Seven Kingdoms was not a story of simple ambition. It was the story of a man preparing for an apocalypse. This was the deepest secret carried by the conqueror. It was not a thirst for power that drove him across the realm with fire and blood, but a desperate need to unite humanity before the long night arrived. To anchor this secret to the bloodline, Aegon did not use a grand crown or a famous sword. He used a simple dagger, a weapon made of Valyrian steel, small enough to be hidden, sharp enough to cut through any armor. On its blade, in the secret runes of old Valyria, he had the prophecy inscribed. This dagger became the dynasty's most guarded relic. It was passed down in secret from king to heir, generation after generation. The king who sat the Iron Throne knew that his true purpose was not to rule the realm, but to unite it. The burden of the song was passed along with the steel, but the weight of this knowledge was a slow poison. Successive generations lived in the shadow of a doom they could not fully comprehend. Jaehaerys II forced a marriage between his own children. Because the prophecy demanded, the bloodline remained pure and strong. Aerys II looked into the flames and saw only the shadow of his own fears. He mistook the coming darkness for the treachery of his own lords. His paranoia burned the very kingdom he was sworn to protect. The burden of the song did not make him a savior. It unmade him into a monster, and Rhaegar was the most haunted soul of the entire dynasty. He believed himself to be the prince that was promised, the warrior of fire. He read every scroll in the libraries of the Red Keep. He trained in the yards until his hands bled. He became a warrior to fulfill a prophecy, but he eventually became convinced he was wrong. The dragon must have 3 heads. He needed a third child, a union of ice and fire. He looked to the north, to Lyanna Stark, and made the decision that shattered the realm. He did not act out of simple love or rebellion. He acted out of a desperate, consuming need to fulfill the song he heard in his dreams. He sacrificed his dynasty, his family, and his life for a vision. He died on the banks of the Trident, crushed by the warhammer of Robert Baratheon. With him fell the last chance for a peaceful transition of power. The dynasty burned for the prophecy. The dream of the conqueror became the ruin of his descendants. But the song did not die with him. The dagger survived the sack of King's Landing. It slipped through the fingers of kings and courtiers. falling through the wreckage of the dynasty into the shadows of the new world. The song of ice and fire did not vanish when the dragons died. It simply waited for a new voice to sing it. That voice would eventually belong to a crippled boy in Winterfell and a young girl who learned to walk in the shadows. The dagger, once a symbol of royal burden, became an instrument of chaos. It was used in an attempt to steal the life of Bran Stark, a boy who would become the memory of the world. Littlefinger, a man who played the Game of Thrones with no regard for prophecies or ancient songs, used the weapon to spark a war that tore the realm apart. He did not know that the steel he held in his hand carried the very secret of humanity's survival. He only saw a tool to climb the ladder of chaos. And so, the blade that was meant to unite the Seven Kingdoms against the cold became the very catalyst for their division. The War of the Five Kings bled the land dry, leaving it broken and vulnerable just as the winter Aegon feared began to descend. But destiny has a way of correcting its course, even through the bloody detours of human ambition. The dagger found its way into the hands of Aerea Stark, a girl who had no interest in crowns or prophecies. She was not a queen, nor was she the prince that was promised in the traditional sense. Yet, when the dead finally breached the wall and the long night fell upon Winterfell, it was this small blade of Valyrian steel that struck the final blow. In the Godswood, beneath the weeping face of the weirwood tree, the ancient foe was shattered into 1,000 pieces of ice. Aegon's dream was realised, not by a grand army united under a Targaryen king, but by a quiet strike in the dark. The song was sung. The fire had met the ice, and the world was saved by the very weapon that had carried the burden of the prophecy for 300 years. In the end, the history of Westeros was not shaped by the grand designs of conquerors, but by the quiet whispers of the past, carved into a piece of steel that survived the fall of empires. Aegon the Conqueror carried a secret. It was not just the dragons, though they were spectacle enough. It was a dream, a vision of a night that never ended, of a winter that would swallow the world. He had this prophecy inscribed onto a Valyrian steel dagger, a burden meant for his heirs, a truth he guarded close to his chest. But how do you explain such a thing to the millions of faithful you have just brought under your rule? You do not. You give them something else entirely. So Aegon went to Old Town. He entered the Starry Sept, the holiest of places in the Andal faith. He knelt before the High Septon. The 7 oils were placed upon his brow. This was the calculated conversion, a masterstroke of political theatre. To the deeply suspicious population of Westeros, the Dragon Lord was no longer just a foreign invader from a cursed and destroyed peninsula across the sea. He was a king anointed by their god. He wrapped himself in their symbols, their holy words, their hope. It was a careful transaction, a shield of faith raised against a lifetime of fear. But the transaction required a deeper compromise, a hidden ledger. There was the matter of the family customs, the incest, the marriages between brother and sister that kept the dragon blood strong. The faith taught this was a sin so deep it could corrupt a soul entirely. So a secret agreement was struck, a dark bargain made far from the public square. The High Septon agreed to overlook the family's incestuous customs. He would offer a full public blessing of the dynasty, and in return, the royal house would become the sworn protector of the faith. A blind eye was turned. The 7 teachings were bent around the blood of the dragon. The Targaryens could keep their ancient traditions alive, and the church could keep its new power. The cost of this deal was simply deferred. It was not paid in coin but in patience. For as long as Aegon sat the Iron Throne, with his iron grip and his great black dragon Balerion, the underlying tension remained deeply buried. As long as the shadow of the dragon covered the land, the Septons and the faithful held their tongues. They had accepted a foreign king into their temple, and they had made a deal to overlook the rot at the heart of his house. But the faith never forgot. The pious lords remembered the compromise. They remembered the indignity of blessing a family whose marriage bed defied the very core of their doctrine. The moment Aegon was gone, the moment a weaker king sat the throne, The Faith would remember its grievance. The men of the Faith militant did not simply lay down their swords. They hid them. They sharpened them in the cloisters, waiting for the first sign of weakness. The Targaryens had bought time, but they had also bought a simmering enemy. The truce held only because the dragon was absolute. But absolute power cannot be inherited forever. The throne would eventually pass to a king who did not have the strength to command such a bargain. And when that day came, the Faith would demand its full reckoning. The altar could not stay quiet forever. The seven-pointed star would eventually seek its vengeance against the three-headed dragon. That day arrived sooner than the realm prepared for. When Aegon the Conqueror finally closed his eyes in death, the crown passed to his eldest son, Aenys. Aenys was not his father. Where Aegon was iron and shadow, Aenys was silk and song. He was a weak, indecisive ruler who sought to please everyone and ended up pleasing no one. He lacked the terrifying presence of Balerion the Black Dread. Riding instead the smaller, gentler dragon Quicksilver, the Septons and the pious lords saw their moment. The shield of fear that Aegon had built began to crack, and the simmering hatred of the faithful bubbled to the surface. The spark that lit the bonfire of rebellion was a royal wedding. Blind to the delicate nature of the truce his father had negotiated, Aenys decided to marry his daughter Rhaenyra to his son and heir Aegon. To the Targaryens, this was simply keeping the blood of the dragon pure, a continuation of their ancient Valyrian customs. But to the Faith, it was an intolerable abomination, an open insult to the Seven. The High Septon, speaking from the Starry Sept in Old Town, denounced the marriage and called the king a tyrant and a heretic. The response was immediate and violent. The Faith militant, dormant for a generation, rose up in open rebellion. The Starry Sept unleashed the stars and the swords. The poor fellows, tens of thousands of armed pilgrims, took to the roads, hunting down Targaryen tax collectors and sympathizers. The warriors' sons, an elite order of anointed knights, fortified the hills and prepared for war. King's Landing itself became a hostile territory, with holy zealots scaling the walls of the Red Keep to assassinate the royal family in their beds. Terrified and helpless, Aenys fled to the safety of Dragonstone, where the stress of the uprising ultimately claimed his life. But the Faith's triumph was short-lived, for the death of Aenys paved the way for his half-brother, Maegor. Maegor did not possess his brother's desire for peace, nor did he care for the delicate feelings of the Septons. He claimed the throne by force, mounted Balerion the Black Dread, and set out to extinguish the rebellion in blood and ash. When the warriors' sons gathered in their thousands at the Sept of Remembrance, Maegor did not offer terms. He rode his dragon to the holy hill and bathed the Sept in dragonfire, burning hundreds of knights alive as they prayed to their gods. For 6 bloody years, Maegor waged a relentless war against his own subjects. He offered a bounty of a silver stag for the scalp of any poor fellow, and a gold dragon for the head of a warrior's son. Yet for all his cruelty, Maegor found that you cannot kill an idea with a sword. The more holy men he slaughtered, the more the small folk rallied to their cause. The realm was tearing itself apart, caught between a tyrant on a dragon and an army of religious fanatics. It was only after Maegor's mysterious death on the Iron Throne that a young king named Jaehaerys, the first of his name, found the path to peace. Jaehaerys understood what his predecessors did not. He saw that the Targaryens could not rule a kingdom that hated them, nor could they completely destroy the faith of millions. He offered a new bargain. The crown would disarm the Faith militant, stripping the Septons of their holy armies. In return, the crown would pledge to always protect the Faith. To resolve the issue of incest, Jaehaerys and his advisors introduced the doctrine of exceptionalism. They argued that the Targaryens were not like other men. They rode dragons, they did not burn, and they came from an ancient empire that operated under different spiritual laws. Therefore, the rules of incest did not apply to them. The High Septon accepted this compromise, and peace was finally restored. The three-headed dragon and the seven-pointed star had reached a fragile truce, but the memory of the blood spilled would linger in the shadows of Westeros for centuries to come. The bargain with the High Septon was a triumph of diplomacy, a velvet glove that allowed the Targaryens to wrap their iron fist in the cloth of the faith. But Aegon understood that different kingdoms required different tools. The Riverlands were ruled not by a devout Andal king, but by an ironborn tyrant named Harren the Black. And Harren did not fear the faith. He feared nothing. Not until he saw the shadow of Balerion's wings. Harren the Black had spent 40 years building a fortress that he believed could withstand any army ever assembled. Harrenhal was monstrous in scale, its towers higher than any in Westeros, its walls thicker than any ever raised by the first men or the Andals. It was a monument to Harren's cruelty and ambition, built on the backs of thousands of slaves who died in the swamps of the God's Eye. And when Aegon Targaryen landed in the Riverlands, Harren retreated behind these walls. He had food for a decade, water for a century, and the confidence of a man who had never seen a dragon up close. Aegon offered him a choice: bend the knee or die. Harren laughed. What could a dragon do against stone and iron? The answer came when Balerion the Black Dread rose over the highest tower. When he opened his maw above the battlements, the sky itself seemed to groan. The massive stone walls, impossibly thick, began to glow a deep, terrible red. Then they melted. Stone flowed like water down the sides of the towers, the carved faces of Harren's proud dynasty, twisting and dissolving into a molten river. Inside, Harren and his sons burned alive, their flesh searing in the impossible heat, their last breath swallowed by the roar of the beast. The horrific melting of the massive fortress was complete in a single night. Nothing remained of the greatest castle ever built, but a blackened, twisted ruin, weeping stone tears for centuries to come. And yet the story does not end there. The castle was never truly habitable again. The lingering curse of Harrenhal is believed to be fueled entirely by the agonizing deaths of House Hoare in those towers. Their terror and pain is said to have fused with the very stone itself. Every lord who has tried to tame Harrenhal has been touched by madness, starvation, or a violent end. The walls remember. They remember the heat, the despair, and the absolute finality of the dragon's judgment. This single brutal act established the reign of terror that defined the early Targaryen dynasty. Lords across the realm realized that their ancient keeps and towering fortresses were no longer safe. The dragon had rendered the very concept of the castle obsolete. A siege could be won in hours. A king could be burned in his own hall. The fear of Balerion's fire was the foundation upon which the Iron Throne was first raised. It was a reign of ice in the hearts of men, a quiet dread that kept the great houses in line for the generation of conquest. Feudalism was built on the promise of a refuge, a stone sanctuary that could outlast any army. Harrenhal proved that the age of the castle was over. The age of the dragon had begun. But Aegon Targaryen was not merely a king of ashes. He was the architect of a new order. Once the lesson of Harrenhal had been seared into the memory of every lord in Westeros, he could afford to sheathe his sword. The real work of the dynasty had only just begun. The shadow of the dragon would hang over the realm for generations. But a kingdom requires more than just a shadow. It requires a throne, a law, and a purpose. From the melted ruin of Harrenhal, the Targaryen peace was born. With the ashes of House Hoare still warm, Aegon turned his gaze southward and westward, where the remaining kings of Westeros scrambled to face a threat they could no longer ignore. The illusion of safety behind stone walls had shattered. But the pride of kings is a stubborn thing. It would take one more great demonstration of power to truly cement the dragon's grip on the continent. This came on a vast dry field in the Reach, where the combined hosts of the King of the Rock and the King of the Reach met the Targaryen invaders. Nearly 55,000 men stood against Aegon and his sisters. It was the largest army the realm had ever seen, a glittering sea of steel and chivalry. But Aegon did not deploy his men in a traditional line of battle. Instead, for the first and only time, all three dragons took to the sky together. Balerion, Meraxes and Vhagar unleashed a storm of fire that turned the dry grass into a roaring furnace. The Field of Fire, as it would forever be known, claimed the lives of 4,000 men in a matter of minutes, including King Mern of the Reach and his entire lineage. King Loren of the Rock fled, only to bend the knee the very next day. When word of this devastation reached Winterfell, King Torrhen Stark marched south with 30,000 Northmen, determined to defend his ancestral home. But when he reached the banks of the Trident and saw the massed Targaryen host, flanked by 3 colossal beasts that had already swallowed 2 kingdoms in flame, Torrhen chose wisdom over pride. He crossed the river, laid his ancient crown at Aegon's feet, and arose as the Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North. He became known as the King Who Knelt, a title born of mockery, yet his submission saved thousands of northern lives from a fiery end. With the continent finally subdued, Aegon did not return to Dragonstone to rule. He chose, instead, to build his capital at the mouth of the Blackwater Rush, where he had first set foot on the mainland. Here, he constructed a seat of power that would serve as a physical manifestation of his conquest. He commanded his soldiers to gather the swords of all the lords who had fallen or surrendered to his dragons. Thousands of blades, twisted, broken and still sharp, were brought to the fledgling city of King's Landing. There, in the great hall of his new fortress, Aegon had Balerion blast the heap of steel with his Blackfyre. For 50 days and nights, the dragon's breath melted the swords, fusing them into a monstrous, jagged chair of black iron. The Iron Throne was not a seat of comfort. Its edges were sharp, its back was a forest of jagged points, and its steps were perilous to climb. Aegon designed it this way intentionally, believing that a king should never sit easily upon his throne, lest he forget the weight of his responsibility and the violence that put him there. It stood as a grim testament to the conquest, a monument of fused steel that reminded every lord who entered the hall of the price of rebellion. Under the rule of the Dragon King, the 7 fractured kingdoms were forged into a single realm. The laws were unified, the borders were erased, and the small folk, who had suffered for centuries under the endless petty wars of rival kings, finally tasted a lasting peace. The conquest was complete, but the legacy of the dragon was just beginning to unfold. Before we dive deeper into this incredible journey, I'm curious. Where in the world are you watching this from? Drop a comment below and let our global community know. And if you're finding this as mind-blowing as I am, hit that like button to help more people discover this story. The fire that melted the black stone of Harrenhal was the same fire that forged the Iron Throne. But fire is not the only element that shapes a kingdom. Dorne was shaped by the sun, by the wind that howls through the Red Mountains, by a patient and stubborn defiance that dragon flame has never been able to truly conquer. When Aegon the Conqueror finally turned the full might of his kingdom toward the southernmost tip of the continent, he expected a short war, a season, maybe 2. He was deeply, fundamentally wrong. The First Dornish War was a nightmare of attrition. It was not a war of grand battles where dragons could decide the day. It was a war of ambushes, of poisoned wells, of armies that vanished into the sand like water. The Dornish did not hold castles to be burned. They burned them themselves, denying the invader shelter. They struck from the mountains, killing 100 men, then disappearing into caves that had no map. They fought a war of shadows, and the Iron Throne bled for it. Then came the wound that changed everything, the fall at Hellholt. Meraxes, the great golden she-dragon, took a scorpion bolt directly through the eye. She fell from the sky in a terrible spiral of fire and broken bone. Rhaenys Targaryen, the rider, the sister wife of Aegon the Conqueror, was lost. The official histories say she died instantly, crushed by the fall. The Dornish told a different story. They claimed they found her alive, broken and bleeding, but still breathing. They claimed they held her. This tale was never confirmed, but it hung over the war like a spectre, a ghost that refused to be laid to rest. Aegon's rage was absolute. He burned the Planky Town. He burned castles that were already abandoned. He sent the dragon Balerion into the mountains to roast the land itself. But the war dragged on. The lords of Westeros grew tired. The cost was immense. The kingdom he had united was beginning to fracture under the strain of a war that seemed unwinnable. Aegon made a final play. He summoned every army he could raise. The Reach, the Stormlands, the Riverlands, the Crownlands. He would make one last, terrible advance into the Dornish heartland. He would not stop until Dorne was a desert of ash. He would erase its people from the world, if that was what it took. The army assembled in the mountains. The encampment stretched for miles. The 3 dragons of the Targaryens rested on the hillsides, their eyes like molten gold in the firelight. The command tent was a fortress of canvas and guarded steel. Inside, Aegon sat with his lords and his remaining family. The final orders were ready. The war was about to reach its absolute terrible conclusion. And then the Dornish envoy arrived. He was a single man, lean and sun-darkened. He wore no armor. He carried no weapon. He walked calmly through the heart of the army, without a guard. He was brought before the conqueror, who sat in the center of the tent, the sword Blackfyre laid across his knees. The lords of the 7 kingdoms watched in silence. The Dornishman did not kneel. He simply held out a scroll. "From the Princess of Dorne," he said. His voice was clear, unafraid, carrying a quiet authority that silenced the room. Aegon took the scroll. He broke the seal. The red sun and golden spear of House Martell pressed into the wax. He read the letter. The silence in that tent has echoed through history. Aegon read the words once. His expression did not change. Then he read them again. He did not order the man killed. He did not tear the letter in half. He did not give the signal for the war to begin. He sat in absolute stillness. The fire crackled. The lords held their breath. The Dornish envoy waited, patient as stone. Aegon finally looked up. His face was unreadable, but something had shifted behind his eyes. He dismissed his lords. He called for his maester. He wrote a response. He signed a treaty. The war was over. The army disbanded. The dragons returned to Dragonstone and King's Landing. Dorne remained free, the only kingdom to resist the Targaryens successfully, the only wound on the map of the conquest that never healed. Aegon never explained what the letter said. He sealed it away, locked it in a vault, and never spoke of it again. It is believed he destroyed it before his death, taking the secret entirely to his grave. But the mystery has festered for 3 centuries. What could possibly inspire such a complete surrender from the most powerful man in the world? What threat could make the rider of the Black Dread fold his hand? The darkest theory, the one that makes the most sense, involves Rhaenys. If she had survived the fall of Meraxes, she was a hostage. But a normal hostage could not stop a conqueror. A king can always choose to sacrifice the one prisoner for the greater good. A king can always choose revenge. The Dornish must have threatened something worse than death. The theory states that the letter threatened to torture Rhaenys, not just her body but her soul. The Dornish are an ancient people with strange customs and older magics, living so close to the shadow of the East. The letter is said to have threatened to use this deep knowledge to inflict an eternal conscious suffering on his sister wife, a magic that would bind her spirit to an endless state of torment, beyond the reach of any rescue or any act of vengeance. Aegon could burn Dorne. He could kill every man, woman, and child. He could salt the earth, but he could not break that curse. There were no dragons in the world that could fight a spell on the soul. The only way to save Rhaenys from an eternity of pain was to accept the terms. He had to walk away. He had to betray his own conquest to protect her eternal peace. This is the terrible heart of the lost letter of Dorne. It exposes the deepest vulnerability of the conqueror. It shows that absolute power has a limit, and that limit is not a fortress or an army. It is the love for a person whose salvation lies beyond the reach of fire and blood. Aegon took the secret to his grave. He ruled for years in a peace that was bought with his silence and his defeat. But the realm had seen him back down. The lords had watched the dragon lower his head. The fear that held the 7 kingdoms together was no longer absolute. When Aegon finally died, on Dragonstone in the 37th year after the conquest, the crown passed to his son by Rhaenys. Aenys was a gentle king. He was born from fire, but he was not made of it. He inherited a throne that had been held together entirely by his father's will, and that will had been broken by a single letter. The realm did not instantly rebel, but it began to question. The lords had seen the conqueror accept defeat. They had seen the limits of the dragon's power. The myth of invincibility had a crack in it now. The silence around the lost letter was not just a mystery. It was a structural weakness in the foundation of the dynasty. And in the reign of a gentle king who lacked his father's fire, those structural weaknesses would begin to break wide open. The peace that Aegon the Conqueror secured with that mysterious letter from Dorne did not survive his passing. When the Conqueror's fire finally dimmed, the crown passed to his eldest son, Aenys. The reign of Aenys was a disaster. He was a gentle man ruling a brutal realm, and the wolves of Westeros smelled blood. The realm fractured, and in the chaos, a darker dragon took flight. The violent usurpation of the throne by Maegor the Cruel and his bloody war against the rebellious Faith militant would stain the Targaryen dynasty with a stain no amount of dragonfire could ever burn away. To secure this throne, Maegor needed a fortress that could hold his darkest secrets. The Red Keep had been started by Aegon the Conqueror, but it was Maegor who shaped it into a monument of paranoia. The dark construction of the Red Keep's secret passages and the immediate execution of all the builders is one of the most chilling episodes in the castle's history. Guided by his mother Visenya, a known sorceress, Maegor designed a hidden labyrinth within the walls. Whisperways, spy holes, escape tunnels. Once the masons and carpenters had finished this secret network, they became a liability. They knew the very bones of the castle. So Maegor solved the problem with brutal finality. He had every single one of them executed. Their bodies were sealed into the foundations, their blood mingling with the mortar, ensuring the full map of the Red Keep secrets would never find the light of day. But a dynasty built on terror is a house built on sand. The end of Maegor's reign is as mysterious as it is grim. Maegor's mysterious death on the Iron Throne, with rumours pointing to the chair itself as the executioner, remains the most fitting legend of his life. One morning, his courtiers found him lifeless upon the throne. There was no poison, no assassin's dagger. The only injury on his entire body was a deep cut on his hand, a wound that could only come from the throne's own jagged swords. The official word was that he died of a broken heart or a sudden sickness, but the whispers in the streets were far darker. The Iron Throne, they said, had rejected him. It had judged the abomination, and it had executed him. The 1,000 swords of Aegon's conquest, forged by Balerion the Black Dread, had become a living monument to judgment. The throne itself was the executioner. Maegor the Cruel was dead. The abomination was gone, but the scars he left on the dynasty were permanent. The Iron Throne stood empty, a monument to both conquest and judgment. The secret passages of the Red Keep were silent, holding the ghosts of the builders. The realm had learned the terrible cost of absolute power. The Targaryen dynasty had survived its darkest tyrant, but the shadow of Maegor would hang over every king who followed. The blood he spilled had watered the roots of the family tree, and the dynasty would never be the same. Out of the ashes of Maegor's tyranny rose a new hope for the Seven Kingdoms. The crown passed to Jaehaerys, the first of his name, a young prince who would become known to history as the Conciliator. Where his uncle had ruled with fire and blood, Jaehaerys chose the path of wisdom, law and compromise. He was only 14 years old when he ascended the Iron Throne, yet he possessed a maturity that far exceeded his years. Beside him stood his sister wife, good Queen Alysanne, whose compassion and sharp mind would help shape the greatest era of peace Westeros had ever known. Together they embarked on a grand progress across the realm, healing the deep wounds left by decades of war. Jaehaerys did not seek to crush his enemies. Instead, he offered them a hand of reconciliation. He pardoned those who had fought against his family, offered amnesty to the remnants of the faith militant, and worked tirelessly to codify the laws of the land, creating a unified legal system that applied to highborn and lowborn alike. For 55 years, the Old King, as he came to be known, ruled with a steady hand. He built the King's Road, connecting the far reaches of the continent, and brought clean water out of the crowded streets of King's Landing. Under his watch, the realm flourished, the population grew, and the power of the Targaryens reached its absolute zenith. But even the longest summer must eventually give way to autumn. The tragedy of Jaehaerys' reign was not found in war, but in the slow, agonizing loss of his beloved family. One by one, his children and his cherished queen slipped away, leaving an aging, lonely king to face the ultimate question of his legacy. Who would succeed him? With his eldest sons dead, the line of succession was thrown into dangerous uncertainty. To prevent a bloody civil war before it could even begin, the old king called the Great Council of the Year 101. Lords from every corner of Westeros gathered at Harrenhal to debate the claims. It was a momentous decision that would set a precedent for generations to come, establishing that the crown could not pass to a woman, nor through a female line. The choice fell upon Viserys, the grandson of Jaehaerys. When the old king finally closed his eyes for the last time, he left behind a realm at peace, a treasury full of gold, and a dynasty that seemed unbreakable. But the very compromise that secured the peace would lay the seeds for the most devastating conflict the world had ever seen. The reign of Maegor the Cruel may have ended on a blood-soaked throne, but the shadow he cast was longer than his own life. The secret passages of the Red Keep were sealed with the lives of their builders, and the kingdom fell into a fragile peace under the boy King Jaehaerys. But the true monster of that age was not a man, it was a dragon. Balerion the Black Dread. Maegor had broken the will of the beast, but he could not break its nature, and in the quiet years that followed, the greatest creature the world had ever known grew restless in his chains. The court of King Jaehaerys and Queen Alizanne was a deliberate attempt to wash away the blood of Maegor. They created the king's peace, they fostered learning, they listened to their small folk, but in the highest towers of the Red Keep, the old shadows clung. Princess Rhaenyra, the queen in the east, wore her grief like a crown of iron, and her daughter Aerea wore her anger like a shield. Aerea had been a bargaining chip, a bride for the usurper. She had survived Maegor's bed, but she had not escaped the shadow he cast. As she grew older, her defiance grew sharper. She challenged her mother. She challenged the king himself. The only thing that seemed to call to her, the only thing that understood her fury, was the creature in the dragon pit that had once served her tormentor, Balerion. And so, in the dead of night in the year 58 AC, Aerea Targaryen did what no one had dared do since the death of Maegor. The keepers found the chains of the Black Dread shattered. The largest pit in the dragon pit stood empty. Aerea had walked through fire to reach her dragon. Or perhaps Balerion had recognized the blood of the dragon in her, and he had accepted her as his last rider. She climbed onto his back and took to the sky. It was not a leisurely flight. It was a rebellion. Balerion roared into the dawn. Far beyond the control of the girl on his back, the dragon did not turn south for the summer sea or west for the sunset sea. He turned east. He flew directly towards the place of his birth, the smoking ruins of old Valyria. For over a year, Aerea and Balerion vanished. King Jaehaerys sent ships across the narrow sea. Rhaenyra searched the lands of the east. No sign was ever found. The realm whispered that the princess was dead, that the Black Dread had finally returned to the wild, that the doom had claimed them both. Aerea was given up for dead. Then, in the middle of the year 59 AC, a dragon was spotted over Blackwater Bay. It did not fly with the majestic purpose of its youth. It limped through the sky. It crashed into the sands of the dragon pit, its wings folding awkwardly, its chest heaving with great rattling breaths. The keepers rushed out to meet it. It was Balerion, but he was not the same beast that had left. He was gaunt, starving, and his hide was covered in hideous wounds. deep, smoking gashes that had not healed. They did not look like the wounds of a storm or a battle with another dragon. They looked like something had tried to burrow into him. They looked like the marks of an ancient evil. Something had attacked the largest dragon in the recorded history of the world, and it had very nearly killed him. When they managed to calm the beast and bring him down, they found Princess Aerea clinging to the base of his neck. She was alive, but what was left of her could not properly be called human. Her skin was cracked, giving off a heat so intense the air shimmered around her. Strange, wriggling forms moved just beneath the surface of her flesh. Grand Maester Benefer was summoned, but his arts were useless. When he tried to place a silver basin of water to cool her, the metal turned red and warped from the sheer fever. The water inside it boiled. The things that swelled beneath her skin were not a sickness. They were living creatures. When he cut into her flesh to try and relieve her suffering, he found parasites that defied every law of nature. They writhed in patterns that seemed almost intelligent. They possessed tiny, human-like faces on elongated bodies. One of the attending maesters swore he heard them whispering before they died. The princess's own screams when they came were not her own. They were the echoes of 1,000 tortured voices from the ruins of the Freehold. She had been a host, a vessel. The horrors of Valyria had tried to use her body to enter the world again. She screamed for hours, a sound that did not come from a human throat. And then she died. The maesters burned her body, and the parasites that had erupted from her flesh, fearful that whatever horror she had brought back from the east might spread. The smoke that rose from the pyre was thick and black, unnatural, carrying a smell of ash and copper. The official story was simple and discreet. Princess Aerea died of a wasting fever. Valyrian's wounds were caused by a storm over the sea or an eruption of a volcano, but the truth was far darker. Balerion had flown directly over the doom of Valyria. The ruins of the Freehold were not empty. Something lived there. Colossal, terrible entities, older than the Targaryen dynasty, twisted by the cataclysm and the blood sorcery that had caused it. The Black Dread, the beast that had melted Harrenhal and set the Riverlands ablaze, had been beaten and driven away by these horrors. He had returned to the only home he remembered, begging for peace, carrying the grievous scars of the impossible. The story that King Jaehaerys allowed to be written was a lie, but it was a kind lie. It protected the realm from a truth it could not comprehend. The doom of Valyria was a cataclysm that shattered a continent, but it did not kill everything. The blood sorcery of the Valyrian Freehold, the experiments that twisted flesh and fused men to dragons, it did not simply evaporate in the fires of the doom. It crystallized. It mutated. It became a part of the land itself. The creatures that had wounded Balerion were the children of the doom. They were the twisted legacy of the blood sorcerers who had not escaped. They were not simple animals. They were the guardians of a dead empire, or perhaps the vengeful spirits of its final atrocities. This secret was buried so deep that even the most learned maesters feared to speak of it. It shattered the myth of Targaryen supremacy. The family that had conquered Westeros was not the pinnacle of Valyrian power. They were the survivors, the refugees. The seat of their ancient power was not a glorious homeland. It was a tomb, guarded by nightmares that could break the greatest dragon ever born. Jaehaerys the Conciliator, the old king of wisdom and peace, made a silent vow that day. No dragon would ever fly east again. The world of old Valyria had not died peacefully. It had been corrupted from within, and that corruption was still festering in the ruins, waiting for something to disturb its slumber. The wounds of Balerion were a message from the grave of Valyria. The doom was not an ending, it was a transformation, and whatever had been born from that fire was still waiting for the Dragon Lords to come home. Jaehaerys understood that the greatest threat to his dynasty was not a rival house or a foreign invasion. It was the very homeland of his family. The answer to the Song of Ice and Fire might lie in the ruins of Valyria, but the price of seeking it was the soul of the realm. When Balerion the Black Dread finally touched down in the yard of the Red Keep, the dragon was barely recognizable. His immense black scales were scored by wounds that did not close. They wept a thin black smoke, and the heat of his body was so intense that the ground beneath him cracked. Slumped against his spine, barely conscious, was Princess Aerea Targaryen. She had run away from the politics of the court, seeking adventure, but she returned carrying something far darker than an adventure. The Grand Maester was summoned immediately. What he found would become the most deeply buried secret of Jaehaerys I's reign. Aerea was placed in the royal bedchamber, but her body was rejecting every attempt at care. The fever that held her was unlike any ever recorded. It was not the hot sweat of a common sickness. It was a steady, unnatural cooking of the flesh from the inside. Her blood did not flow as it should. When they tried to bleed her, as was the common practice, the blood that escaped was almost too hot to touch. The king himself came to visit her, and he felt the heat radiating from her skin from a hand's breadth away. The Grand Maester's private report, the one he wrote for the king's eyes alone, describes this fever in clinical, detached language. But the horror is obvious between the lines. He knew. He was watching something beyond the known laws of the body. The heat did not break. It did not cycle. It simply burned her alive. Then the movement began. Beneath her skin, in her arms and legs, there was a squirming. It was not the trembling of a muscle in spasm. It was the writhing of something alive. The Grand Maester made an incision to investigate what he thought might be an abscess. Instead, a fat, pale worm pushed its way out of the wound. It was the size of a child's finger, and it had a face. A tiny, wrinkled face with eyes that were open, and a mouth that opened and closed as if tasting the air. The Grand Maester wrote that he felt a chill of pure terror for the first time in his long career. The full extent of the infestation was a waking nightmare. The worms were everywhere. The Grand Maester and his assistants were forced to cut her open from throat to groin to remove them. They were wrapped around her organs. They had burrowed into the tissue of her lungs. They were living in the fluid behind her irises. The procedure to remove them from her eyes, which the Grand Maester describes with a trembling pen, involved delicate hooks and a steady hand. Aerea screamed the entire time. Her voice gave out after the first hour, but her mouth remained open in an endless, silent howl as the things were pulled from her tear ducts. King Jaehaerys I made a decision that would echo through the hidden history of his dynasty. He could not let this horror be known. If the realm learned of what had infected his niece, panic would sweep the Seven Kingdoms. The faith would call it a curse. The lesser houses would whisper that the blood of the dragon was tainted by something inhuman. He ordered an immediate quarantine. The entire floor of Maegor's holdfast, where Aerea lay, was sealed. Guards were placed at every door with orders to run any man through who tried to leave without the king's seal. The cover-up was immediate and absolute. When Aerea finally died, her body was not laid out for mourners. There was no silent vigil, no public viewing. Her remains were wrapped in salt and vinegar-soaked linens, taken to the dragon pit under the cover of night, and burned on a pyre. The ashes were scattered into the bay. The rooms where she had suffered were scrubbed with lye and sealed forever. The Grand Maester's full report, the one containing the descriptions of the human face parasites and the unnatural boiling fever, was placed in a sealed iron chest. The chest was carried down to the deepest vault beneath the Red Keep, into the black cells that held the most dangerous secrets of the crown. The king ordered that no one ever speak of it again. The official story would be that Princess Aerea died of a sudden fever, a tragic but natural end for a rebellious girl. The truth, the reality of what her body had become, was locked away in the darkness. The quarantine worked. The secret held. The realm never knew the true horror of Aerea Targaryen's death, but the cover-up left a deep scar on the dynasty. It proved that the Targaryens were willing to hide their deepest wounds behind a wall of absolute silence. It set a precedent for burying the grotesque truths that their lineage so often produced, and it left a terrifying question hanging over the Red Keep. If the blood of the dragon could host such a horror once, what guarantee was there that it could not happen again? What other secrets were the Targaryens burying beneath their castle floor? The story of Aerea Targaryen is not just a personal tragedy. It is a warning about the price of curiosity, and a reminder that some things brought back from the ruins of the old world cannot be simply burned away. They wait, sealed in a vault, sealed in the blood. The silence that fell over the Red Keep after Aerea Targaryen's death was a heavy, tangible thing. The Maesters had witnessed the impossible. They had seen the heat, the worms, the final agonies of a young princess, and they did what Maesters do best. When faced with the horrible truths of magic and blood, they sealed the records. They wrote their findings in careful, clinical script, and then they locked them away in the deepest vaults of the Citadel. The official story was vague, a fever, a tragic accident during a dragon ride, but the truth has a way of seeping through the cracks in the floorboards. The lords and small folk whispered. They remembered the doom of Valyria. They wondered openly if the Targaryen bloodline was touched by something dark, something monstrous. This was the crisis that faced Jaehaerys I. He is called the Conciliator, a name that suggests gentle diplomacy, but his reign began with a brutal calculus. He had to restore the reputation of a dynasty that had nearly destroyed itself. Maegor the Cruel had butchered thousands. The faith had risen in rebellion, and now a Targaryen princess had died carrying monsters inside her. The very blood of the dragon was being seen as a curse. So Jaehaerys and his brilliant Queen Alysanne, along with the half-maester Septon Barth, constructed a legal and theological masterpiece. They did not ask the faith to forgive the Targaryens. They asked the faith to kneel to a higher truth. The doctrine of exceptionalism declared that the Targaryens were not bound by the same moral laws as ordinary men. The blood of the dragon was not human blood. It was the fire of the gods channeled through Valyria. Incest, which was an abomination for common men, was a sacred reproduction for the Targaryens. It was the only way to keep the dragon-riding blood strong enough to defend the realm. The faith, having lost its army to Maegor, could not refuse. They accepted the doctrine. The Targaryens were officially exceptional. They were above sin. But what happens when a system built on exceptionalism produces a child that is not exceptional? What happens when a prince is born with the cruelty of Maegor, or a princess born with physical deformities? The doctrine worked for the public image. In private, it demanded a ruthless self-censorship. The weakest fruits of the family tree had to be removed. We find fragments of this truth in the historical records. Jaehaerys and Alysanne had many children. Some died in infancy, which is common, but others simply vanish. Princess Syra was too rebellious, too free-spirited. She was not merely exiled to a comfortable life in the free cities. She was stripped of her identity. Visera was married off against her will and died young. Gale, the Winter Rose, was heartbroken and took her own life. And those who were born with physical or mental flaws were given the harshest fate of all. They were given to the Silent Sisters, the women who serve the stranger, who prepare the bodies of the dead. A Targaryen child who could not be displayed to the lords of Westeros as a perfect dragon lord was simply made dead to the world. They were masked. They were silenced. They were made to serve in the funeral cults of the Seven Kingdoms. Their names erased from the lineage books. It was a permanent living death. The realm never knew the true number of these children. Their existence was the ultimate secret, the hidden price of the carefully maintained image of the Silver Dragon. For the 55 years of Jaehaerys' reign, this system worked perfectly. The realm enjoyed the longest period of peace and prosperity in its history. Roads were built, laws were codified, the dragons grew fat and happy under the dome of the dragon pit. The lords of Westeros learned to look past the strange Valyrian customs because the realm was stable. The peace was built on a compact. The Targaryens would not openly terrify the realm, and the realm would not ask too many questions about what happened behind the closed doors of Maegor's holdfast. But this peace was fragile. It was a peace of ignorance. By hiding the broken children, by exiling the difficult ones, the Targaryens never truly confronted the weakness in their bloodline. The madness was not bred out. It was hidden. The cruelty was not punished. It was silenced. The doctrine gave them a shield, but it also gave them a license. Future kings would look back at the reign of Jaehaerys and see a dynasty that was unchallenged, untouchable. They would inherit the belief in their own exceptionalism, without inheriting the wisdom of the king who created it. Jaehaerys the Conciliator died in the 101st year after the conquest. He left behind a stable realm, a full treasury, and a dynasty that seemed stronger than ever. But he also left behind a lie. The lie that the Targaryen bloodline was pure and blessed. The truth was far more complicated, and the next generation would inherit the throne without the wisdom to maintain the careful illusions of their grandfather. The cracks in the facade were already forming. The peace had been paid for with silence, and silence is a debt that always comes due. The old king, Jaehaerys the Conciliator, had given the realm peace for more than half a century. He had codified its laws, produced the doctrine of exceptionalism to shield his family's unique customs, and guided the Targaryen dynasty to its golden age. But as he lay dying in the year 101 after the conquest, he could not solve the only question that truly mattered: who would inherit his throne? His son and heir, Balon, had died before him, leaving a tangle of claims that threatened to tear the family apart. The crown, by strict right of birth, should have passed to Rhaenys Targaryen, the daughter of his eldest son. But the lords of Westeros had never accepted a ruling queen, though Jaehaerys summoned them to Harrenhal to decide the matter with their voices. The Great Council of 101 AC gathered in the blackened ruins of the Hoar Fortress, a place where dragons had already proven their power by melting stone into twisted towers. For 13 days, the lords of the realm presented their petitions. Lord Corlys Velaryon, the Sea Snake, argued passionately for his wife Rhaenys, who was a dragon rider, a woman of intellect and will. But the voices against her were louder. The lords feared a queen. They feared what it would mean for their own daughters. And when the count was finished, 14 votes for Rhaenys against 20 votes for Viserys did not tell the full story. The crown was pressed onto the head of a man. It was not a law passed by the realm. It was a preference expressed by an assembly, and that preference carried the weight of doom. By choosing a lesser male claim over a stronger female one, the council created a dagger pointing directly at the heart of the dynasty. They taught the realm that the Iron Throne was not bound by blood alone, but by the approval of the powerful. It was a lesson that would be tested again and again until the answer was written in fire and death. When Viserys I took the throne, he was a natural peacemaker. He had been chosen for his stability, his kindness, his desire to heal the wounds of the council. He kept his brother Daemon at arm's length. He married his cousin Aemma, and he fathered a daughter, Rhaenyra. When Aemma died in the birthing bed, Viserys gave Rhaenyra everything. He named her his heir over any future son. He made the lords of the realm kneel and swear oaths to her. He meant to smash the precedent of the Great Council by force of will. But Viserys made a fatal mistake. He married Alicent Hightower, the daughter of his hand, a woman of piety and sharp political instinct. He believed he could have a happy family. He believed Alicent would serve Rhaenyra. He was blind. The growing divide between the queen and the princess was a chasm that Viserys refused to acknowledge. He saw Alicent and Rhaenyra as two children he loved. He did not see that Alicent feared for her sons' lives, that she dreaded what Daemon might do if Rhaenyra took the throne. He did not see that Rhaenyra saw Alicent's sons as usurpers waiting to happen, as threats that had to be removed. He did not see the factions forming in his own small council. He did not see the Greens and the Blacks meeting in separate chambers. He saw a united family because he wanted to see it. He held feasts where both sides smiled through gritted teeth, and he called it harmony. He refused to call a new council to settle the succession beyond his death. He refused to banish Daemon, who whispered poison into Rhaenyra's ear. He refused to hear the whispers of war echoing through the corridors of the Red Keep. Viserys I was a good man, but good men can be the most dangerous rulers of all. They leave the cracks unsealed because they believe in good intentions, and the cracks in his house grew into canyons. While the court of King's Landing pretended unity, a quiet war was being waged in the sky. The strength of House Targaryen had always been their dragons, and in the reign of Viserys I, they had more dragons than at any time since the conquest. Every faction understood that the question of succession would not be decided by parchment or oath, it would be decided by fire. So both sides began to collect their weapons. Rhaenyra had Syrax, a golden queen of a dragon, gentle in temperament but formidable in size. Her uncle, Daemon Targaryen, rode Caraxes, the blood worm, a creature of immense violence and battle experience whose roar could shake the walls of a fortress. Princess Rhaenys, the queen who never was, rode Melis, the swiftest living dragon, whose scarlet scales made her a streak of fire across the sky. Across the narrow sea, on Dragonstone, Rhaenyra's sons claimed dragons of their own. Jaehaerys on Vermax, Lucerys on Arax, Joffrys on Chirax. The Blacks were building an arsenal of young, fast dragons bred for war. On the other side of the city, the Greens were doing the same. Queen Alicent's eldest son, Aegon, sat upon a dragon of breathtaking golden beauty named Sunfire, a creature so magnificent he was called Sunfire the Golden, said to be the most regal dragon ever seen. His brother Aemond, bold and reckless, claimed the most powerful living dragon in the world, Vhagar, the ancient mount of Queen Visenya, the dragon that had flown with Aegon the Conqueror and burned the armies of Dorne. Vhagar was a weapon of mass destruction, and when Aemond climbed into her saddle for the first time, the balance of terror shifted forever. Princess Helena rode Dreamfire, a dragon of pale blue and silver, gentle but fierce when provoked. It was an accumulation of force designed for deterrence. But deterrence rarely holds in a family that believes in fire and blood. Every dragon claimed was a statement. Every egg hatched for a child of either faction was a soldier enlisted in a war that had not yet been declared. The seeds of the dance were not sown in a single act of malice. They were sown in the quiet decision of a council that refused to accept a queen. They were watered by the willful blindness of a king who saw his family fracturing and chose to look the other way. And they were harvested in the patient, silent gathering of dragons. The storm was gathering. It was gathering in the shadow of Vhagar's wings, in the golden glint of Sunfire's scales, in the patient, crimson stare of the blood worm. The realm held its breath, not knowing that the very breath would soon become a wildfire. The family of the dragon had too many weapons, and not enough love to control them. The house was standing directly in the path of its own destruction. The seeds of the dance had been sown for years, and in the year 129 after the conquest, they finally blossomed into open war. The death of Lucerys Velaryon at Storm's End was the spark, but it was Daemon Targaryen who turned that spark into a wildfire. He was not a man who believed in half measures. He understood that the Greens had struck at the very heart of Rhaenyra's family. He would return the favour tenfold, and he would do it inside the Red Keep itself. Daemon found his instruments in the dark corners of King's Landing. He did not reach for knights or lords. He reached for criminals. The first was a man known only as Blood. He was a former gold cloak who had fallen from grace, dismissed from the City Watch for excessive violence. He was a brute, a killer for hire. The second was a man called Cheese. He was a rat catcher by trade, and he knew the Red Keep better than any guard. He knew the hidden passages, the service tunnels, the crawl spaces where rats scurried and secrets could be carried. Cheese knew how to get in. Blood knew what to do once he got there. Those passages had a very specific history. They had been built by Maegor the Cruel. Centuries earlier, Maegor had constructed the Red Keep as a fortress of paranoia, lacing its walls with murder holes and secret ways. He had executed every mason and builder who worked on those passages to ensure their secrets died with them. But some secrets never die. They are passed down, stolen, rediscovered. And on this night, those passages carried a death sentence for a child. On a quiet night in the year 129, Blood and Cheese made their way inside. They bypassed the Kingsguard without a sound. The guards were drunk or sleeping, or simply outmatched. The assassins emerged from a hidden door behind a tapestry in the Queen's chambers. There they found Queen Helaena lying in bed with her 3 children, the twins, Jaehaerys and Jaehaera, who were 6 years old, and the young Prince Maelor, who was barely 2. Cheese moved first. He held a dagger to Helena's throat, silencing her before she could scream. Blood seized the children from the bed. The older boy began to cry. The little girl froze in terror. The toddler, Maelor, remained quiet, unaware of what was happening. The men whispered their demand. They had been sent by Lord Daemon. They wanted a son for a son. The prince who was lost at Storm's End demanded a life in return. They forced the queen to choose. They knew the twins were often dressed alike. They demanded she identify which child was the male heir. Helaena, trembling, her mind racing, pointed to Maelor. It was a desperate gamble. She hoped to sacrifice her youngest son to save the life of her firstborn. But the assassins were not fools. They saw the lie in her eyes. One of them knew the family well by reputation. He took the child closest to the window, the one who bore the stronger features of his father, King Aegon II. It was Prince Jaehaerys. The boy woke fully to the feeling of being lifted from the bed. He looked at his mother and began to scream. Cheese held Helaena down, pressing the blade against her neck, hard enough to draw blood. Blood drew his own dagger. He looked at the boy. He looked at the queen. And then he did what he had come to do. He cut the prince's throat. Blood sprayed in a wide arc. It splattered across the wall, across the bed, across Helaena's face. The boy did not suffer long. Within seconds, his body went limp. Helena's scream followed. It was so raw, so loud, that it echoed through the stone drum and into the throne room itself. But by the time the guards reached the nursery, Blood and Cheese were gone. They had slipped back into the shadows of the secret passages, their hands still wet with the blood of a king's son. The murder of Prince Jaehaerys was not just an assassination, it was a desecration. The Red Keep had always been seen as the safest place in the Seven Kingdoms, the home of the dragons. If the dragons could not protect their own children in their own beds, what hope was there for anyone else? The psychological devastation of Queen Helaena was immediate and total. She had been a fragile queen before, prone to strange fits and prophetic whispers. She spoke of prophecies that no one understood, visions of beasts and blood. But after that night, her mind shattered completely. She was found in the nursery, cradling the body of her son, covered in his blood, rocking back and forth. She never spoke clearly again. She wandered the corridors of the Red Keep, muttering broken phrases. The beasts beneath the boards, she would whisper, the rat and the blood, the rat and the blood. The public unrest was explosive. The small folk of King's Landing had endured the hardship of the war with grim resignation, but this was different. This was the murder of a child, a prince, inside the walls of the Red Keep. Mobs gathered outside the castle gates, demanding justice. Some called for Daemon Targaryen's head, others called for the war to end. The city became a powder keg of grief and rage. The Green faction's authority was severely undermined. Helena's decline continued for months. She refused to eat. She refused to speak with her husband. She flinched at every sound, seeing Jaehaerys in every shadow. Finally, during the chaos that gripped the city, she saw a window, a way out. She threw herself from a high window of the Red Keep, falling to the stones below. She did not suffer long. It was a mercy for her, but a devastating blow to the morale of the Greens. Daemon Targaryen had achieved his revenge, a son for a son. The Greens were reeling, but the cost was enormous. The cold-blooded nature of this act showed the realm exactly what the Targaryen family was capable of when turned against itself. This was not a war between strangers. This was family. Family cruelty has no bottom. Daemon proved that he would burn down the very foundations of the house to win. As the war escalated, the dragons began to take to the skies. The next phase of the dance would not be fought in the shadows of the nursery. It would be fought in the open sky above Westeros, where brother would fight brother, dragon against dragon, and the realm itself would burn to ash. Blood and cheese was just the first terrible shadow of the horrors that the Targaryen civil war would bring. The murder of Prince Jaehaerys was meant to send a message, a sharp echo from Rhaenyra's camp, that the war they had started would be felt in the most intimate and brutal of ways inside the Red Keep. But if blood and cheese was meant to break the Greens, it instead hardened their resolve, particularly in Aemond, whose temper had always burned hotter than his brother Aegon's. The loss of his nephew, a son of his own brother, was a debt he now intended to collect from Daemon directly, and he had the means to do it. Vhagar, the largest living dragon in the world, was his to command. The stage for this final confrontation was set not by a parley or a formal lenge, but by Aemond himself, who took Vhagar to the Riverlands and began burning everything. Daemon might be able to rally. He was baiting him, daring the rogue prince to come out and face the older, larger beast. Daemon, never one to refuse a direct confrontation, took to the skies on Caraxes, the Blood Wyrm, a dragon with a reputation for ferocity that matched his own rider. They met above the God's Eye, a vast lake in the Riverlands, in the middle of an apocalyptic aerial battle that would define the dance of the dragons for all time. It was a confrontation that had no equal. Vhagar was ancient, massive, a dragon of pure crushing weight. Caraxes was leaner, longer, and far more aggressive in the air. They tore into each other, their flames and screams echoing for miles across the water. The battle was not a simple jousting match. It was a grappling, twisting, screaming knot of dragon and rider, locked in a death embrace high above the lake. The two beasts began to fall, and it was in that moment, as the world was spinning around them, that Daemon Targaryen did the unthinkable. He unstrapped himself from his saddle. He stood, balanced against the chaos of the fall, and as Caraxes and Vhagar sank their teeth into one another, Daemon leaped. He did not try to escape the fall. He launched himself directly at his nephew, driving the Valyrian steel longsword, Dark Sister, through Aemond's remaining eye, the sapphire that had replaced the one lost in childhood. Aemond was dead before he hit the water. The fall killed both dragons. Caraxes, mortally wounded, crawled to the shore of the lake and died. Vhagar, the dread of the realm, sank into the deep water of the God's Eye, her mass consigned to the silt and the darkness. Daemon's body was never recovered, but Aemond's was years later. Divers sent to the bottom of the lake found the bones of Vhagar resting on the lakebed, and strapped into her saddle, still chained to his dragon as he was in life, was the skeleton of Prince Aemon Targaryen. There he lay, the sapphire still sitting in the empty socket of his skull, a testament to the depth of the hatred and the price of that vengeance. It was a duel that stripped away any remaining illusion of royal dignity. There was no trial by combat, no noble duel. It was two of the last great Targaryen dragon riders of their age, killing each other in a desperate, ugly cascade of fire, steel and gravity over a lake. The loss of Vhagar and Caraxes, and the men who rode them, was a mortal blow to the power of the dynasty itself. The dragons that remained in the war would not survive much longer, and the Targaryens would never truly recover from the wound they inflicted on themselves that day. What followed was a slow, grinding descent into the final acts of the war, a war that no longer seemed to be about succession, but simply about extinguishing the other side. With Vhagar gone, the Greens had lost their ultimate deterrent, their shield of absolute terror. Yet the Blacks could not celebrate, for the loss of Daemon and Caraxes left Rhaenyra isolated, her most fearsome commander and her most loyal protector swallowed by the depths of the God's Eye. The realm was now a bleeding beast, stumbling blindly in the dark. In King's Landing, the atmosphere turned toxic. Rhaenyra, once the realm's delight, was now a queen consumed by paranoia and grief, surrounded by enemies both real and imagined. She looked upon her subjects not with the grace of a ruler, but with the suspicion of a tyrant, ordering executions and demanding taxes that drove the starving small folk to the brink of madness. It was this desperation that sparked the tragedy of the Dragonpit. A one-eyed prophet, known only as the Shepherd, whipped the common people into a religious frenzy, convincing them that the dragons were the source of all their misery. Tens of thousands of desperate, angry citizens marched upon the Great Dome, armed with nothing but pitchforks, clubs, and sheer suicidal fury. What followed was a slaughter of both man and beast. 5 dragons, chained and unable to fly, fought desperately against the tide of humanity, burning thousands to ash before they were finally overwhelmed, hacked to death by the sheer weight of numbers. Syrax, Rhaenyra's own golden dragon, descended into the chaos and was brought down as well. In a single night of blood and fire, the living symbols of Targaryen supremacy were reduced to butchered meat and shattered bone. The queen was forced to flee her own capital, penniless and broken, selling her crown just to buy passage back to Dragonstone. But there no sanctuary awaited her. King Aegon II, scarred, crippled, and fueled by a lifetime of resentment, was waiting in the shadows. The end of their bitter rivalry was not a grand battle, but a cruel execution, as Aegon fed his half-sister to his wounded dragon, Sunfire, while her young son, Aegon the Younger, was forced to watch. Yet even this horrific victory brought no peace. Aegon II would not live to enjoy his triumph, poisoned by his own lords who saw that the war could never end as long as he drew breath. When the dust finally settled, it was young Aegon III who ascended the Iron Throne, a traumatized boy who had watched his mother die, ruling over a kingdom of ashes and widows. The dragons were gone, the great lords were dead, and the dynasty that had conquered Westeros with fire and blood was left shivering in the cold, forever haunted by the day they tore their own world apart. The God's Eye swallowed Daemon Targaryen, Caraxes, Aemond One Eye, and Vhagar in a single apocalyptic plunge. It was a death so violent it seemed to shake the very foundations of the world. A final act of brotherly hatred that ended the greatest aerial duel in the history of Westeros. The news of Aemond's death spread like wildfire, and the Greens scattered. But for Rhaenyra, the victory tasted like ash. She took King's Landing without a fight, the gates opening to her as the city surrendered. But the city she inherited was not a prize. It was an open wound. The blockade maintained by the Velaryon fleet had choked King's Landing for months. No food came in. The markets were empty. The people of the city, once the cheering masses who had welcomed Rhaenyra, now stared at her with hollow eyes. They were starving, and when people starve, they listen to anyone who offers them an explanation. A man known only as the Shepherd stood in the square of the Great Sept and preached to the crowds. He was a terrifying figure, wild-eyed and gaunt, his voice carrying the weight of a man who believed himself chosen by the gods to deliver judgment. He did not speak of politics or succession. He spoke of sin. He told them that the dragons were demons, that the Targaryens had brought the wrath of heaven down upon the city by their incest and their tyranny. He said the dragons were eating the food that belonged to the people, that the beasts were bloated on cattle while children starved. He pointed to the great dome of the Dragonpit on the hill of Rhaenys and told the mob that the monsters inside were the reason for their suffering, and the mob believed him. On the 7th day of the 10th moon of the year, 130 after Aegon's conquest, the shepherd walked down the streets of King's Landing with a torch in his hand. Behind him came a mob of 10,000 souls. They were not soldiers. They were bakers and butchers and beggars. They were mothers who had lost their children to the famine. They were men who had watched their wives starve. They were the desperate, the broken, the forgotten, and they were hungry for blood. They marched up the hill of Rhaenys, their footsteps shaking the cobblestones. The dragon keepers saw them coming and barred the great bronze doors of the dragon pit. It was not enough. The mob hit the doors like a wave crashing against a cliff, and the doors splintered. The dragon keepers fought bravely, but they were torn apart. The mob poured into the darkness of the pit, their torches casting long, flickering shadows against the stone walls. Inside the dragon pit, the air was thick with smoke and the smell of blood. The screams of the mob mixed with the roars of the dragons. The dragons were chained, 5 of them. These were not the great war dragons that had darkened the Riverlands. Rhaegar was at the bottom of the God's Eye. Sunfire was wounded and hiding on Dragonstone. The dragons that remained in the dragon pit were the last hope of the Targaryen dynasty. Dreamfire, the Blue Queen, once ridden by Lyanna, Tyraxes, the dragon of Joffrey Velaryon, Shrykos and Morgul, the hatchlings of Helena's twins, and Syrax, the golden dragon of Rhaenyra herself. The mob did not care which dragon was which. To them, they were all monsters. Shrykos was the first to die. The hatchling was chained to the floor, and the mob surrounded her. They beat her with stones and clubs. They stabbed her with spears and butcher knives. She screamed, a high, terrible sound, but the mob did not stop. They cut her throat and left her body to bleed out on the stone. Morgul followed, crushed under a falling pillar as the mob smashed the supports of the dome. Tyraxes was different. He was older, larger, and he fought back. He broke his chains and surged into the crowd, his jaws snapping, his fire consuming the mob in waves. He killed 50 men before they brought him down. But they brought him down. They grabbed his wings and pulled. They stabbed his belly and watched his insides spill onto the stone. He dragged himself across the floor, leaving a trail of blood and viscera before they finally ended him with a spear through the eye. Dreamfire was the most tragic. She was a beautiful dragon, blue and silver, and she had been chained in the darkness for months. When the mob came, she snapped her chains in terror. She did not want to fight. She wanted to escape. She thrashed against the pillars of the dome, trying to break through the walls, trying to find the sky. But the mob surrounded her. They attacked her from all sides. And in her panic, she brought the entire dome crashing down. Thousands died in that moment, men and women and children, crushed beneath the falling stone. Dreamfire herself was buried under the weight of the temple that had been her prison, her body pinned beneath the rubble. As the life bled out of her, Syrax was the last to die. She burst through the gates and into the streets of King's Landing. She was Rhaenyra's dragon, the symbol of the Queen's power, and she was magnificent in her terror. She breathed fire into the narrow alleys, turning the mob to ash. She crushed men under her claws. She bit them in half, but they kept coming. They poured out of every door and window, a tide of human fury. They threw chains around her legs. They climbed onto her back. They tied ropes around her neck and pulled her down. She struggled. She fought. She killed hundreds, but there were always more. They cut her throat, and the blood poured out like a river. They stabbed her through the heart. They gutted her like a pig in a slaughterhouse, and when she was dead, they carved her body into pieces and dragged them through the streets as trophies. The shepherd himself stood at the entrance to the dragon pit, watching the slaughter. He did not fight. He simply pointed, and the mob obeyed. When the dome collapsed, he raised his hands to the sky and declared that the gods had answered his prayers. The mob carried him through the streets on their shoulders. A king of the common people, crowned in blood and ash. 5 royal dragons dead in a single afternoon. It was the greatest single loss of dragon life in the history of House Targaryen. But more than that, the Dragonpit Massacre did not just kill dragons. It killed the very idea that the Targaryens were gods among men. For centuries, they had ruled as divinities. They had conquered with fire, maintained peace with terror, and married brother to sister because they believed themselves above the laws of men. The Dragonpit Massacre proved that they were not above anything. They were flesh and blood. Their dragons could be killed. Their crowns could be taken. Their blood could be spilled in the gutter. The mob had done what no army had ever managed. They had killed the idea of the dragon. Rhaenyra heard the screams of her dragons from the Red Keep. She watched from the windows as her city burned. She knew the crown she wore was now hollow. The city was lost. The throne was lost. In the days that followed, the mob tore through King's Landing. They hunted Targaryen loyalists. They burned the dragon pit to its foundations. And Rhaenyra, the queen who had been a dragon rider all her life, was forced to flee her own capital in disguise. She sailed for Dragonstone, hoping to find safety in the fortress of her ancestors. But the men who held Dragonstone were no longer loyal to her. They had made a deal with her brother, and as she walked through the gates of her own castle, she was walking into a trap that had been set the moment her dragons died in the pit. The Dragonpit Massacre was the breaking of the stones, but the breaking of the Targaryen spirit was a slower, quieter collapse. In the year 153 after the conquest, deep in the bowels of the Red Keep, a tragedy unfolded that was far more damning than any mob. A clutch of dragon eggs, treasured by the crown, had finally shown signs of life. A hatchling was coming. The keepers watched with a mixture of desperate hope and deep anxiety. The dragons of House Targaryen had been dwindling for decades. Smaller eggs, weaker beasts, a slow fading. But when this egg finally cracked open, the creature that emerged was not a dragon in any meaningful sense. It was a deformity, a withered, wingless, sickly thing. Its body was stunted and twisted, a dull grey-green covered in sores. Its wings were only pathetic flaps of skin, incapable of lifting it off the ground. It was born blind. It could barely support its own head. The dragon keepers called it the Last Dragon, a title of bitter mockery. It lived for only a few short years, a prisoner in its own cradle, a living symbol of everything the Targaryens had lost. Almost as soon as the creature was born, dark whispers began to circulate through the court. Poison. It had to be poison. The natural arrogance of the Targaryens could not accept that their divine power had simply failed. There had to be an enemy. The whispers settled on the maesters of the Citadel. The Order of Scholars in Old Town, it was said, had long resented the dragons. The maesters were men of reason, of logic. They built their world on knowledge and ravens, not on the unpredictable flames of magic. The rumour claimed that for generations, the maesters had slowly introduced a substance into the dragon pit, into the very water the dragons drank, something that made the eggs thicken, something that stunted the growth of the hatchlings, something that poisoned the blood itself. Whether this is true or an elaborate conspiracy theory born from grief is impossible to prove, but the belief itself was powerful. The Targaryens began to distrust the very order that had served them for centuries. They saw enemies everywhere. The maesters were blamed. The faith was blamed. The small folk were blamed. But the fear was always the same. The magic was leaving the world, and they were being left behind. For the Targaryens, the psychological shift was absolute. They had defined themselves by their dragons for thousands of years. Their sigil, their words, their entire identity was wrapped up in the power of dragonfire. Without it, they were a noble house with strange customs, nothing more. They could not rule through fear anymore. They could not burn their enemies. The lords of the Seven Kingdoms, who had bent the knee to the conqueror, suddenly realized the chains were made of paper. A profound, hollowing dread settled over the Red Keep. The Targaryens became obsessed with the past. They filled the throne room with the skulls of their ancient dragons, a monument to their own decline. They doubled down on their internal marriages, desperately trying to preserve the Valyrian bloodline, hoping that pure blood might somehow reignite the flame. They retreated into prophecy, clinging to the promise of a prince who would bring the dragons back. But deep down, in the quiet of their chambers, they knew they were no longer dragon lords. They were survivors of a dead empire. The last dragon was gone, and with it, their soul had been hollowed out, leaving behind a dynasty that was simply waiting for the inevitable fall. The years that followed were marked by a slow decay. King after king sat the Iron Throne, each weaker than the last, their reigns shadowed by the loss that had come before. The dragons had been more than weapons. They were the glue that bound the Seven Kingdoms to the Iron Throne. Without them, the great lords of Westeros began to look at the Red Keep not with awe, but with calculation. The regional wardens, the proud lords of Winterfell, Casterly Rock, and Storm's End, realized that a king who could not burn them was a king who could be defied. The Targaryens were forced to rely on politics, marriages, and fragile alliances, playing the same dangerous game as the lesser lords they once looked down upon. Every rebellion that followed, every civil war and whisper of treason, was born in the shadow of that empty dragon pit. The magic was gone, replaced by the cold, hard steel of ordinary men, and the realm would never be the same again. I hope you're as amazed by this as I am. If you want to stay updated on more content like this, make sure to subscribe and join our community of curious minds. Trust me, what's coming next will challenge everything you thought you knew. The rumor that surrounds the death of the last Targaryen dragon is not just a whisper carried on the wind. It is a calculated accusation against the very institution that holds the keys to knowledge in Westeros. The creature born in the dragon pit in 153 AC was weak, deformed, and wingless, and the theory that has lingered for generations is that it did not simply die. It was killed, by design, by the Maesters. This is the heart of the Maester Conspiracy. It is the deeply unsettling theory that the Archmaesters of the Citadel of Old Town did not merely serve the realm as impartial scholars and healers. They actively engineered the extinction of the dragons and the suppression of magic in the known world. To understand why, you have to understand the fundamental conflict between the Citadel and the Targaryen dynasty. The Maesters are an institution built entirely on logic, order, predictability, and the written word. Dragons are the living embodiment of chaos, destruction, and power that cannot be studied or controlled by any chain of office. As long as dragons existed, the Maesters could never truly hold the highest seat of influence in Westeros. The king would always answer to fire and blood before he answered to ink and reason. The conspiracy theory suggests that this was not a matter of a single assassination. It was a slow, multi-generational campaign of suppression. The Maesters had the perfect network for it. They placed their own men in every castle, every court, every council. They raised the Targaryen princes from childhood. They treated their illnesses. They chronicled their victories and their failures. And with every generation, they subtly guided the dynasty toward dependence. This is where the manipulation of the Targaryen kings becomes most visible. Consider the poisoned advice. The Maesters encouraged the Targaryens to see themselves as Westerosi kings above all else, downplaying their Valyrian origins. They discouraged the study of prophecy and magic, framing it as superstition. They promoted marriages that were politically safe, rather than bloodlines that would produce strong dragon riders. They rewrote history, burying the secrets of Valyria in the deepest vaults of the Citadel, ensuring that the dynasty slowly forgot its own source of power. But the manipulation goes far deeper than advice. There is evidence, scattered across the lore, of medical malpractice that goes beyond negligence. The last Targaryen dragons were not born weak by accident. They were born from eggs that failed to hatch, or hatched into stunted, sickly creatures. The Maesters assigned to the royal household had access to Queen's chambers, the nursery, the birthing beds. The theory holds that they were administering treatments, tonics, and perhaps poisons that were designed to do two things. First, to make the Targaryen women less likely to carry dragon eggs that were viable. Second, to suppress the natural growth of any dragons that did manage to survive. The small, deformed creature of 153 AC was not a tragic anomaly. It was the final victory of a long campaign. The proof, if it exists, is hidden in the restricted archives of the Citadel in Old Town. Deep beneath the tower of the Seneschal, behind locked doors and guarded by oaths, there is a library of forbidden knowledge. Samwell Tarly stumbles into this truth. When he arrives at the Citadel, he finds scrolls and texts that have been deliberately removed from circulation. Books containing the true history of the Long Night, detailed studies of dragon anatomy, and treatises on how to kill the creatures. The Maesters have studied the methods of suppression for centuries. They know exactly how to snuff out a magical bloodline. They have done it before. What makes this theory so dark is not just the act of killing dragons. It is the calculated dismantling of a family that had trusted these men implicitly. The Targaryens believed their maesters were loyal servants. In truth, they were executioners working in slow motion. The madness of Aerys II, the melancholy of Baelor the Blessed, the weakness of Aegon the Unlikely. These traits could be read as natural flaws of a highly intermarried bloodline, but the conspiracy suggests a more sinister pattern. The Maesters were not just observing the decline, they were nursing it. They were ensuring that the dynasty became emotionally unstable, physically weakened, and politically isolated. The tragedy of House Targaryen, seen through this lens, is not just the story of a family that grew too arrogant to hold power. It is the story of a ruling house that was systematically dismantled by the very institution that swore to serve it. The dragons did not simply fade from the world. They were pushed out. The magic did not die on its own. It was buried alive in the vaults of Old Town, locked away by men who believed that a world without fire and blood was a safer world. And in that belief, they sealed the fate of the Dragon Lords forever, leaving nothing but the memory of fire in the hands of men who preferred the cold weight of a chain. The dynasty, stripped of its wings, was now completely vulnerable, and what followed was a slow fall into madness, war, and finally extinction. The slow death of the dragons engineered by the Maesters didn't just weaken Targaryen power, it changed the nature of their rule. Without fire and blood at their command, they had to rely on oaths, on the fragile chain of succession. It was a chain that King Aegon IV, the Unworthy, broke not with a hammer, but with a pen. Lying on his deathbed, his body rotting from his own excesses, Aegon issued a decree that legitimized all of his highborn bastards. He transformed them from threats into rivals. He set the stage for a century of war. His son, King Daeron II, was a scholar and a diplomat. He brought Dorne into the realm through marriage and peace, but he wasn't a warrior. Daemon Waters, the eldest and most skilled of Aegon's bastards, was everything Daeron was not. Handsome, charismatic, and gifted the very symbol of Targaryen conquest, the Valyrian steel sword Blackfyre by his father. When the warlike lords of the realm looked at Daemon, they saw a conqueror. When the small folk looked at him, they saw a proper king. Daemon took the name of his sword as his own, eventually crowning himself King Daemon I. The first Blackfyre rebellion was inevitable. The war came to a head on the red grass field. It is a battle of songs and nightmares. Daemon and his twin sons were cut down by arrows, while the hammer and the anvil of loyalist forces crushed his army. His surviving supporters were exiled. They fled across the narrow sea, forming the Golden Company in the cities of Essos. They called themselves the Sons of the Dragon, a sellsword army sworn to a lost cause. The war didn't truly end that day. It just moved abroad, festering in the waiting years. Over the following decades, the Blackfyre Pretenders rose again and again. First rebellion, second, third. They were the shadow that stretched over every Targaryen reign. By the time of the War of the Ninepenny Kings, the male Blackfyre line had become twisted. Maelys the Monstrous, the last of the direct male claimants, was a giant with a second head growing from his neck, a physical testament to the desperation of a cause too long denied. When a young Barristan Selmy struck him down, the male line ended in a pool of blood on the stepstones, but the female line survived. In the shadows of the free cities of Essos, daughters of the Black Dragon were born, married into the powerful families of Pentos and beyond, and had children. The claim was passed down through the female bloodline, hidden in silk and gold. It became a secret currency, a rumour among the sellswords of the Golden Company that the true king was waiting across the water. This surviving line would eventually weave itself back into the story of the Iron Throne, a claimant who would shake the very foundations of Westeros. The Blackfyre Pretenders were never truly gone, they were simply waiting. The female Blackfyre line, carrying the blood and the old claim, survived not in the great castles of the Seven Kingdoms, but in the manses of Pentoshi magisters and the war councils of exiled lords. They became a story whispered in the dark, a ghost of a dragon that refused to fade into the history books, a final echo of Aegon, the unworthy's poisoned gift to the realm. It was in the wealthy city of Pentos where this shadow began to take a solid, dangerous form. A rich magister named Illyrio Mapatis and a master of whispers named Varys began a game that would span decades. They did not just plot to overthrow a king, they engineered a restoration. But whose restoration was it? To the world, they presented a boy, a survivor of the sack of King's Landing, supposedly the son of Prince Rhaegar Targaryen, saved from the knives of Lannister soldiers. But those who knew the history of the Golden Company, those who knew that sellswords do not break contracts, written in blood for nothing, saw a different truth. The Golden Company, founded by bitter steel to seat a Blackfyre on the Iron Throne, had spent generations fighting Targaryens, yet they marched for this boy. Some say the contract they signed was not written in ink, but in the ancient shared blood of the dragon. If the young prince is indeed a descendant of the female Blackfyre line, then the dragon has returned to Westeros. Wearing a red cloak over a black heart, the stage is set for a second dance of the dragons, where the lines between true royalty and pretender are blurred beyond recognition. In the end, the crown does not care about the colour of the dragon, only who has the strength to hold the throne. The long, bloody struggle that began with Aegon the Unworthy's final breath is far from over. It is merely entering its final, most devastating chapter. The Blackfyre rebellions had bled the Targaryen dynasty dry. Brother against brother, would-be king against crowned king. By the time the dust settled on those wars, the crown rested uneasily on the head of a ruler who understood a hard truth. Without dragons, the Targaryens were just another family of squabbling lords, clinging to a throne built on fire and fear. That king was Aegon V, the Unlikely, and he was not going to let the dream die slowly. Aegon V was never meant to rule. He was the fourth son of a fourth son, a boy who spent his childhood wandering Westeros in disguise, sleeping in inns and fighting in tourneys as a hedge knight. He grew up loving the small folk, believing in justice and reform. When he became king, he did everything he could to protect the common people. He passed laws limiting the power of the nobility. He earned the enmity of his own lords, and he knew his reforms would collapse the moment he died. Unless he could restore the ultimate symbol of Targaryen supremacy, he needed a dragon. By 259 years after the conquest, that need had become an obsession. Aegon was in his 60s. His sons had made disastrous love matches that shattered his political plans. The realm was restless. History was closing in on him. In his desperation, he turned to the old secrets, the same dangerous knowledge that had elevated his ancestors. He turned to wildfire and to blood magic. He gathered his entire family at Summerhall, the beautiful summer palace built by Daenys II. It was meant to be a celebration, a grand gathering, but the true purpose was hidden inside the walls. He brought the last remaining dragon eggs from the royal vault, cold and grey as stone. He brought the pyromancers and their wildfire, the volatile green fire that had destroyed the Faith militant and fueled the conquest. The plan was to recreate the intense magical heat needed to wake the stone. He was going to force the birth of a dragon. It was a gamble of the highest order. Wildfire is not a tool of creation. It is annihilation in liquid form. The attempt went catastrophically wrong. The fire spread far faster than anyone could have anticipated. It devoured Summerhall from the inside out. The flames consumed the summer palace, turning stone to ash. King Aegon V died in that inferno. The Lord Commander of his Kingsguard, Sir Duncan the Tall, the legendary knight who had stood beside him for a lifetime, died trying to save him or the dream. They were both lost to the fire. And yet, in the midst of that absolute catastrophe, a single thread of life emerged. Rhaegar Targaryen was born that very night, the first son of Prince Aerys. He came into the world on the floor of the burning palace, surrounded by smoke ash, and the screams of his dying family. It was a birth that felt prophetic, the prince that was promised, born amidst salt and smoke, the salt of tears, the smoke of a dynasty's last great failure. Whether it was a ritual gone wrong or a desperate accident born of mad ambition, the result was the same. The Targaryen dream of reviving dragons died in the ruins of Summerhall. The good king had sacrificed himself for a hope that turned to fire. What was left was a scar on the family soul, a secret that would never be spoken of fully. Rhaegar would grow up in the shadow of that terrible night, a melancholy prince carrying the weight of a prophecy he never asked for, and his father, Aerys II, would inherit a crown that was already burning. The tragedy of Summerhall did not break the Targaryens. It refined them into something darker, something desperate, and something doomed. When Aerys II ascended the Iron Throne, the realm did not see a madman. They saw a young, handsome prince, full of promise. He was generous, quick to laugh, and ambitious. He dreamed of building a new wall to the far north, of turning the deserts of Dorne green with canals, of leaving a legacy that would eclipse even his grandfather Aegon. But the shadow of Summerhall hung over him like a suffocating shroud. He had witnessed the death of his family, the sudden, violent end of the old king, and the birth of his own son in the ashes. The lesson Aerys took from that night was not one of humility, but of terror. The world was dangerous, his enemies were everywhere, and the Targaryens were vulnerable. To secure his rule, Aerys appointed his childhood friend, Tywin Lannister, as his hand of the king. It was a partnership that brought peace and prosperity to the Seven Kingdoms for many years. But it also sowed the seeds of the king's undoing. Tywin was brilliant, cold and efficient. The lords of Westeros began to whisper that it was the Hand who truly ruled, while the king merely wore the crown. This whispered truth festered in Aerys's mind, feeding a growing paranoia. Every glance became a conspiracy, every disagreement a betrayal. The breaking point came at Duskendale, when a defiant lord refused to pay his taxes and took the king hostage. Aerys spent half a year locked in a dungeon, fearing for his life, while Tywin Lannister besieged the town. When he was finally rescued by Sir Barristan Selmy, the man who emerged from those dungeons was no longer the promising young king. He was a hollowed-out husk of a man, terrified of physical touch, obsessed with Wildfire, and convinced that his own son, Prince Rhaegar, was plotting to usurp him. Meanwhile, Rhaegar grew up as a solitary and bookish youth. He was deeply affected by the tragedy of his birth, spending hours among the ruins of Summerhall, with only his harp for company. The music he composed was said to bring women to tears, filled with a profound, haunting sadness. But one day, Rhaegar found something in his books that changed him. He walked out of the library, went to the Master-at-Arms, and declared that he must become a warrior, for it seemed he was destined for a great and terrible struggle. He believed he was the key to a prophecy, the one who must save the world from an oncoming darkness. This obsession would lead him to the great tourney at Harrenhal, under the shadow of the giant melted castle. It was there, before the assembled nobility of the realm, that Rhaegar won the champion's crown. But instead of presenting the crown of love and beauty to his own wife, Aerea of Dorne, he rode past her and placed it in the lap of Lyanna Stark. In that single silent moment, the spark was struck. The fire that began at Summerhall had never truly been extinguished. It had simply waited, smouldering in the hearts of a doomed father and a desperate son, ready to consume the entire realm. The tragedy at Summerhall serves as a perfect, catastrophic introduction to the Targaryen obsession with Wildfire, though that obsession did not die with Aegon V. The dream of fire and rebirth, twisted by fear and madness, was inherited by his grandson, Aerys II. The Mad King's reign is a masterclass in paranoia, and his fixation on Wildfire is perhaps the darkest practical secret the Targaryen dynasty ever produced. Aerys began his rule with intelligence and charm, but the defiance of Duskendale in the year 277, after the conquest, shattered his mind entirely. He was taken captive by Lord Denis Darklyn, a rebellious vassal who refused to submit. For 6 months, the King of the Seven Kingdoms was a prisoner in a damp tower, tortured by the threat of assassination and the constant humiliation of his captivity. When Sir Barristan Selmy dared a suicidal rescue and freed him, Aerys was never the same. The trust was gone. He saw betrayal in every shadow. The man who returned to King's Landing was a creature of suspicion, convinced that every lord, every servant, and every member of his own family was plotting his destruction. It was this paranoia that led him to embrace Wildfire not as a tool of conquest, but as a weapon of ultimate nihilistic defense. He turned in secret to the Alchemists Guild. They had once been the great magicians of the Targaryen court, but their fire magic had waned with the dragons. Now, under the king's direct orders, they were given a singular mission: produce wildfire on an industrial scale. The guild secretly stockpiled tons of the volatile liquid. They hid it in clay jars, beneath the Great Sept of Baelor, beneath the Dragon Pit, beneath the Street of Silk and the Street of Steel. There were caches hidden under the Red Keep itself. The entire city of King's Landing, every major district, was slowly transformed into a single enormous bomb. 500,000 people lived their lives unaware that beneath their homes and their temples, the king had planted the means to erase them all from existence. As Robert's rebellion reached its bloody end, Aerys' madness peaked. Rhaegar was dead. The trident was lost. The Lions of Casterly Rock had breached the gates of the city under the banner of a false peace. Aerys, unhinged and skeletal, gave his final order. He commanded his pyromancers to ignite the caches. "Burn them all," he whispered to the Lord Commander of his Kingsguard, Jaime Lannister. The Targaryen dynasty's final act in King's Landing was set to be the total annihilation of the realm's largest city. Thousands of jars of wildfire, strategically placed over years of secret labour, were to be set alight, turning the capital and its inhabitants into a pillar of green flame. Aerys chose to destroy his own kingdom rather than surrender it. Jaime Lannister stopped him by driving a sword through his back, but the wildfire stayed. The caches remained exactly where Aerys had placed them, a secret legacy of madness buried beneath the streets. It is a haunting thought. The secret of the wildfire is not just a historical curiosity, it is a persistent physical danger. The Alchemists Guild knew where the caches were, but their knowledge was scattered and lost in the chaos of the sack. The Mad King's obsession outlived him. The fire he hoarded for his final spiteful act slumbers beneath the very foundations of the throne his children would one day try to reclaim. The dynasty's motto promised fire and blood. In the end, the fire they left behind was not one of rebirth, but of a stored apocalypse, a testament to a king who loved his dynasty so little he was willing to burn its legacy to the ground. Years after the Mad King's throat was cut, the shadow of his green fire still loomed over those who sought to rule. When Tyrion Lannister was charged with defending King's Landing against the massive fleet of Stannis Baratheon, he did not turn to walls or traditional steel. Instead, he sought out the Alchemists Guild, tapping into the very same dark science that had almost consumed the city years prior. The resulting Battle of the Blackwater was a horrifying realization of Aerys' dream, a night where the bay turned into a blazing emerald hell, and thousands of men were consumed by a flame that water could not extinguish. Yet, the true horror of wildfire is not just its destructive power, but its terrifying decay. As the years pass, the substance becomes increasingly unstable, growing so sensitive that even a sudden temperature change or a heavy footstep can trigger a cataclysm. It is a substance that demands absolute control, yet defies it at every turn. Later, Cersei Lannister would find herself drawn to this same toxic power, utilizing the forgotten caches to obliterate her rivals in a single, devastating stroke that echoed the very madness of the king her brother had slain. In this way, wildfire became the ultimate surrogate for the lost Targaryen dragons. It was a false beast, a cheap and highly volatile imitation of the living fire that once made the Dragon Lords invincible. When the last dragons died, the fire did not leave the world. It simply became bitter, toxic, and hidden in the dark, waiting patiently beneath the cobblestones to consume anyone foolish enough to believe they could ever truly master it. It is one of the cruelest ironies of the Targaryen dynasty that the prince who could have saved his family from the madness of his father was himself undone by a different kind of madness entirely. Aerys II saw enemies in every shadow, hoarding wildfire beneath the streets of his capital, whispering curses at the names of his lords. For his son Rhaegar looked at an ancient scroll and saw a prophecy so absolute, so consuming, that he was willing to burn the realm himself to see it realized. The father's madness was the madness of paranoia. The son's madness was the madness of destiny, and history shows us that destiny can be far more dangerous than fear. Rhaegar was never meant to be a warrior. He was born amidst the tragedy of Summerhall, during the Great Fire in the year 259. After the conquest that claimed the life of his grandfather, King Aegon V, survival itself was a miracle. Those who knew him in his youth described a bookish boy, an air of melancholy clinging to him, as if he carried the weight of that childhood pyre forever within his chest. He was a reader, a thinker, a poet. He played a silver-stringed harp so sweetly that it is said he could make the women of the court weep with the beauty of his songs. He was, by all accounts, the opposite of the conquerors and madmen who had come before him. He was a scholar in a dynasty of dragons, but that all changed in a single moment. Sometime in his youth, Rhaegar journeyed to the citadel, or perhaps to the ruins of Summerhall itself, searching for secrets. He found something, a lost scroll, an ancient text written in the High Valyrian of the old Freehold. We are never told the exact words of this scroll in the chronicles that survive, only the consequence of reading it. The text is lost, but its poison remains. Whatever Rhaegar glimpsed in those pages convinced him beyond any doubt that the end of the world was coming, and that he bore the hero's burden. He was not just a prince of the blood. He was the prince that was promised, and the promise demanded everything. And so the bookish prince transformed himself. He closed his books. He set down his harp. He took up a sword and began to train in the yard until his body ached and his hands bled. He became a formidable knight, not for glory, not for the thrill of combat, but because the prophecy demanded it. He had read about the coming darkness, the threat from the far north, and he knew that only fire and blood could stop it. It was not ambition that drove him. It was a relentless, crushing duty, a fate he could not escape and did not wish to escape. As he grew older, his obsession deepened and took root in his blood. He married Aerea Martell of Dorne, a union of fire and sun. She gave him a daughter, Rhaenys, a spirited girl with a fearlessness that reminded him of the dragons of old. Then came a son, Aegon. Rhaegar looked at the infant in his arms. He saw the blood of the birth. He saw the smoke of the candles. He saw a bleeding star in the dawn sky outside the window. He knew it with a certainty that shook him. Here was the saviour. Rhaegar whispered to Aerea that the dragon has 3 heads. He needed another child. He needed a woman of the north, ice to balance the fire. The prophecy was no longer a guide. It was a command. This is where the obsession became fatal. It blinded him to the world of men. He travelled to the tourney at Harrenhal, the greatest gathering of lords and knights the realm had seen in generations. He won the joust, as the prophecy surely foretold. But when the moment came to crown the Queen of Love and Beauty, Rhaegar rode past his wife, the Princess of Dorne. He rode past the assembled lords of the south. He placed the crown of winter roses in the lap of a maiden of the north, Lyanna Stark. He declared his need for ice before the entire realm. He lit the fuse on a powder keg he did not see. In his mind, he was fulfilling a destiny. He was finding the mother of the third dragon, the third head needed to save the world. But in the eyes of the realm, he had committed an unforgivable insult. He had abandoned his wife, the daughter of the Warden of the South. He had stolen the betrothed of the Lord of Storm's End, Robert Baratheon, and he had taken the daughter of the Warden of the North. He had united half the realm against him in a single act, and he did not care. The prophecy demanded it. What were the politics of men compared to the fate of the world? He took Lyanna. He disappeared with her into the south, to a tower in the Prince's Pass in Dorne. He left his wife, Aerea, and his 2 children, Rhaenys and Aegon, alone in the Red Keep, surrounded by the paranoia of his father, the Mad King, and the hostility of a court that saw them as hostages. He believed that when the war was over, when he had proven himself, he would explain it all. He would ascend the Iron Throne, unite the realm, and fulfill the prophecy with his 3 children. He did not calculate the cost, but Robert Baratheon did not fight for prophecy. He fought for rage. He fought for the love of a woman who had been taken from him. The armies of the north, the Stormlands, the Riverlands and the Vale marched against the Targaryens. The realm bled for Rhaegar's obsession. The madness of the father became the war of the son. Finally, Rhaegar was forced to face the music. He left Lyanna in the tower and gathered his armies. He led the royal forces to the banks of the Trident River. He wore the armour of his house, the 3-headed dragon inlaid in black steel across his breastplate, studded with rubies that burned like drops of blood in the sun. He was a brilliant commander, but his single-mindedness was his fatal flaw. He did not fight a battle of strategy that day. He rode directly for Robert Baratheon. He had to defeat the usurper himself. The prophecy required the hero to face the beast. Robert met him in the waters of the ford. He did not ride a dragon. He rode a warhorse, and he swung a war hammer that was pure brute force. The rubies shattered from Rhaegar's armour as the hammer crushed his chest. He broke the rubies. He broke the armour. He broke the prince. The river swallowed the stones as they fell. The knights of the Kingsguard spent long days afterward dragging the river, searching for the prince's armour, searching for his sword, searching for anything to salvage, but they could not find what was lost. The prince that was promised fell into the dark water and did not rise. His final breath was spent whispering a name, Lyanna. The obsession that drove him took his life. The prophecy he had chased so relentlessly was not a guide out of the darkness. It was the very thing that led his entire dynasty into it. The father's madness of Wildfire, the son's madness of destiny. They left a vacuum, and into that vacuum fell the swords of the rebels, the steel of the Kingslayer, and the last desperate flight of the Targaryen heirs across the narrow sea. Rhaegar's legacy is not the prophecy fulfilled. It is the war lost. It is the children slaughtered in their beds. It is the throne taken by the man whose betrothed he stole. And in the cold towers of the north, a promise was kept that he never fully understood. His fatal obsession ensured that the Song of Ice and Fire would be sung, but not by him. It would be sung by those left to gather the pieces of the world he shattered. Rhaegar Targaryen's obsession with prophecy led him deeper into the ancient scrolls he had found, and the more he read, the more convinced he became that only a child of his blood could fulfill the promise of the prince that was promised. He believed the dragon must have 3 heads, meaning he needed 3 children. But his wife, Aerea Martell, had nearly died giving birth to their daughter Rhaenys, and the delivery of their son Aegon left her so weakened that the Maesters warned another pregnancy could kill her. That placed Rhaegar in an impossible position. He had 2 children, but he believed he needed a third, and according to his reading, the third head had to come from a different line, a union that would bind ice and fire together. So Rhaegar made a choice that would shatter the realm. In secret, he arranged for his marriage to Aerea Martell to be annulled. The annulment was carried out quietly in Dorne, far from the eyes of King's Landing, and it declared his children with Aerea to be bastards in the eyes of the faith. Then, in another private ceremony, he married Lyanna Stark. She was the daughter of Lord Rickard Stark of Winterfell, a girl barely 16 years old, and she had been betrothed to Robert Baratheon. But Lyanna went with Rhaegar willingly. She did not scream. She did not fight. Whether she was motivated by love or by a belief in the prophecy that Rhaegar shared with her, we cannot say for certain. What we do know is that she became his wife, and they began their life together in a remote tower in the mountains of Dorne. But the realm did not know the truth. When Lyanna vanished, word spread that she had been kidnapped and raped by Prince Rhaegar. That lie took hold and would not let go. Robert Baratheon, the man Lyanna was supposed to marry, burned with fury. He had already resented the Targaryens, but now he saw Rhaegar as a monster who stole the woman he loved. And when Lyanna's father and brother rode to King's Landing to demand justice, the mad King Aerys executed them both without trial. That was the spark. The North declared war, and Robert's rebellion became a wildfire that consumed the realm. Thousands died in the battles that followed. Men bled and burned on the Trident, at the Stony Sept, in the shadow of Pike, and beneath the walls of King's Landing. And it all traced back to a secret marriage that no one outside the circle of participants knew existed. The war ended at the Tower of Joy. There, in a lonely stone tower in the Red Mountains of Dorne, Lyanna Stark gave birth to a son. She named him Aegon Targaryen, the same name Rhaegar had given the child he believed would be the Prince of Prophecy. But the boy could never carry that name openly. Robert Baratheon, now king, was hunting down every Targaryen he could find. He had already ordered the deaths of Rhaegar's other children, the ones born to Aerea. If he knew of this child, he would kill him too. So Lyanna made her brother Ned promise to hide the boy, to raise him as his own bastard, to never tell anyone his true parentage. Ned kept that promise. He took the infant south from the Tower of Joy, claiming him as his natural son, and named him Jon Snow. The secret marriage, the annulment, the royal bloodline of the child, all of it was buried beneath a lie that would stand for nearly 2 decades. That lie cost thousands of lives. It destroyed a dynasty and placed a new king on the Iron Throne. And it was built on a secret that only a handful of people ever knew. That Rhaegar Targaryen had set aside his wife, married Lyanna Stark, and fathered a son who was the true heir to the Dragon Throne. The world believed the story of a stolen bride and a brutal prince. But in truth, the prince had taken a second wife, and that union produced a child whose existence would remain hidden until the realm was ready to face the storm. And when that secret finally came to light, it would shake the foundations of everything that had been built on the ashes of Robert's rebellion. The dragon's blood did not die with the Mad King. It survived in the snow of the north, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when the prophecy would call it home. The rebellion that began with a lie ended with a dynasty in ashes. Rhaegar was dead in the river. The Mad King was dead in his own throne room. And 2 children, the last of the dragons, were smuggled out of Dragonstone in the dead of night. Viserys was barely 8 years old. Daenerys was an infant, a storm born on Dragonstone. As the war reached its violent end, they fled east, across the narrow sea, into a world that did not want them. Sir Willem Darry, a loyal knight who had served the Mad King, took them to Braavos. They lived in a house with a red door, and for a short time, Daenerys would remember that as the only home she ever truly knew. But that life ended when Sir Willem died. The servants stole what little remained of their possessions and threw the children out into the streets. The exile of the Targaryens was not a grand campaign. It was a slow, humiliating slide into poverty. Viserys dragged his sister from city to city across the free cities. Maer Tyrosh Pentos. He knocked on the doors of houses that had once sworn oaths to his father. They offered him nothing but closed gates and pity. The boy who was supposed to be a king was reduced to begging for shelter from the merchants who now sat in the seats of power. And then he sold his mother's crown. It was the crown of Queen Rhaella, the wife of the Mad King, the mother of the last dragons. It was made of gold and studded with rubies. It was the last physical relic of the dynasty they had lost, the last proof that they had once ruled the 7 kingdoms. Viserys sold it for the price of passage, a room in a bad inn, a handful of meals. The moment he let that crown go, the psychological damage was done. The crown was not just an object. It was the symbol of everything he had been raised to inherit. Selling it meant accepting, deep in his heart, that he might never sit the Iron Throne. The name Beggar King was no longer an insult whispered by his enemies. It was the truth of his existence. That breakdown did not happen all at once. It happened in increments. Every closed door, every patronizing gift of silver from a man who should have knelt. Every night he had to explain to his little sister why they were hungry, why they were cold, why they were unwanted. The proud, arrogant boy transformed into a paranoid, desperate man. The crown he sold haunted him. He grew to believe that the world owed him a new one, that everyone was conspiring against him, that the throne was his by right, and anyone who denied him was a traitor. This is exactly what Illyrio Mopatis was counting on. In Pentos, the siblings found a benefactor. Illyrio Mopatis was a magister, a cheesemonger who had risen from nothing to become one of the most powerful men in the Free Cities. He took Viserys and Daenerys into his mansion. He clothed them in silks, fed them rich foods, and filled their heads with the promise of restoration. But Illyrio was not a saviour. He was a player in a very old game, and he was working with Lord Varys, the spider who had served the Mad King, and now served whoever best suited his designs for the realm. Together, they manipulated the exiled siblings. They fed Viserys' delusions of grandeur. They told him exactly what he wanted to hear. They arranged a marriage between Daenerys and Khal Drogo, the leader of the greatest Dothraki horde the world had ever seen. Viserys was promised 10,000 screamers in exchange for his sister. He gave away his only remaining family member for the ghost of an army. He believed he was the dragon, the king, the master of the game. In truth, he was a pawn. Illyrio and Varys were moving him across the board, using the Targaryen name to destabilize Westeros and pave the way for their own chosen ruler. Viserys did not walk into the Dothraki Sea as a king. He walked in as a beggar wearing borrowed finery, clinging to the dream of a crown he was never worthy to wear. He sold his mother's crown. He sold his sister. He sold his dignity. And in the end, he demanded a golden crown he could not earn. He got it. Molten gold, poured over his head by the very Khal he had promised to command. The fire that killed Viserys Targaryen was the same fire that woke something far more powerful in the world. Daenerys walked into the flames of his funeral pyre, carrying the stone eggs that Illyrio had gifted her, and emerged with the only true power their bloodline had ever known. The exile of the Beggar King was over. The blood of the dragon was no longer a ghost story. It was alive, rising from the ashes. When Viserys had sold their mother's crown, he sold the last of their dignity for the promise of passage. Daenerys was so young she had no memory of the crown at all. Her earliest history was written in the bruises of their flight, in the cold stares of the magisters who turned them away, and in a single memory that she clutched like a dragon's egg. She remembers a house. It is the only place she was ever truly safe. In her mind it was in Braavos, a house with a red door, and outside that window, a lemon tree. The scent of those lemons, the feeling of the sun on her skin, the bright green of the leaves against the pale sky. For a girl whose entire life was defined by exile, poverty, and the growing madness of her brother, this memory was her entire definition of home. It was warmth. It was safety. It was the promise that the world was not only fire and blood and running, but the memory is deeply wrong. The city of Braavos sits on a lagoon in the far north of the narrow sea. It is a city of stone and salt, of cold fogs and iron ships. The Sea Lord's palace is built on grey pillars. The climate is temperate at best and harsh in winter. It is a city of the north, carved from the mists of a shallow sea. Lemon trees are a plant of the south. They require a subtropical or Mediterranean climate. They need dry summers, mild winters, deep sun and warm soils. Braavos is cold, wet and grey. It is the capital of a region known for its rain, its chill and its fog. The lemon tree is a botanical impossibility. It could not grow in the courtyard of a house with a red door. Not in the Braavos of Daenerys' memory. The climate forbids it. The very geography of the city, with its canals and its salt air, makes it an impossibility. This single fact is the key that unlocks the deepest secret of the Targaryen exile. If the lemon tree could not grow in Braavos, where was the house with the red door? The most compelling answer, supported by architecture, climate, and the hidden politics of the books, is Dorne. Dorne is the southernmost kingdom of Westeros. Its capital, Sunspear, is a land of red stone, hot sun, and deep passion. It is the one place in Westeros where the lemon tree can flourish. The house with the red door is architecturally consistent with the buildings of the water gardens. The summer palace of House Martell. Why would Daenerys remember a house in Dorne when she was told she grew up in Braavos? Because the secret alliance between the Targaryens and Dorne is one of the great hidden narratives of the Exile. After the sack of King's Landing, Sir Willem Darry smuggled the children out of Dragonstone. It is heavily theorized that he did not go straight to Braavos. He took them first to Dorne. There, a pact was signed, the Dornish Pact, a secret marriage pact, sealed in blood and witnessed by the Lemon Tree. It betrothed Daenerys Targaryen to Prince Quentyn Martell, the eldest son of Prince Doran. In exchange for this marriage, Dorne would lend its armies, its resources, and its fury to the Targaryen restoration. Fire and blood united with sun and sand. This pact is a direct plot point in A Dance with Dragons. Prince Doran admits it to his daughter, the secret promise of the sun to the dragon, but the pact failed. Sir Willem Darry fell ill and died. The Dornish gold dried up. The Martells waited for the opportune moment, but Viserys was growing into a dangerous, paranoid young man. The servants stole what was left. Viserys and Daenerys were thrown out of the house. They fled to Braavos in disgrace. They arrived as beggars, not as honoured guests. But Daenerys was only a child. In her trauma, the geography of her exile folded in on itself. The safety of the Dornish house, the red door, the lemon tree. These memories were transposed onto the city she was told was her home. Braavos was the city of her exile, so the house must have been in Braavos. The memory was a composite, a sanctuary built by her mind to protect her from the horror of her life. This is profoundly dark. It means that the single most precious memory of the Mother of Dragons, the memory of the only home she ever knew, is a fiction. The house with the red door is a ghost. The lemon tree is a symbol of a broken promise, a failed conspiracy, and a childhood that was sacrificed on the altar of politics. Viserys told her stories of the house in Braavos to keep her hope alive. Or perhaps he told her the truth of Dorne, and her infant mind simply could not accept the separation. The very foundation of her identity, a longing for the simple life she saw in the hidden house, is a fantasy. She spent her entire life trying to return to Braavos, to find the red door, to smell the lemons again. But the door does not exist in Braavos. It never did. When she thinks of Westeros, she thinks of the red door. When she faces the horrors of Slaver's Bay, she retreats into the memory of the lemon tree. It is her deepest psychological comfort, and it is an impossibility. This opens a terrifying chasm in her story. If the memory of the house is wrong, what else is wrong? The history Viserys told her of the usurper's dogs, the nature of Rhaegar's marriage, the entire mythos of the Targaryen restoration was built on the stories of a desperate, broken prince and the fragmented dreams of a lonely girl. The lemon tree is the proof that her past is not solid. It is a swamp of competing loyalties, secret pacts and manipulated memory. She is a queen without a true history, chasing a house that never existed in the place she looks for it, guided by the scent of a tree that the climate of her mind forbids. This detail is the key that unlocks the door to the greatest mysteries of the Targaryen exile, the truth of her parentage, the identity of the heir who came before her, the very prophecy that guides her family's madness. All of these begin to twist and shift when you realize that the most grounded memory in the story of Daenerys Targaryen is built on a botanical impossibility. The red door hides a garden of broken promises. The lemon tree is the fruit of a secret history that was never meant to be exposed. It is the first of many contradictions that define the final chapter of the Targaryen dynasty, a dynasty whose true history is written not in the chronicles of maesters, but in the unreliable memories of its last survivors, and in the impossible gardens that bloom in the corners of their minds. The memory of a house with a red door was all Daenerys Targaryen had to cling to in exile. But the truth, as her brother Viserys had so often reminded her in his crueler moments, was that home was the luxury the last dragons had never truly known. By the time she stood in the vast, scorching emptiness of the Red Waste, the dream of a lemon tree had been replaced by the reality of scorched earth and dying hope. Her husband Khal Drogo was a mindless shell, brought back by a blood magic that had stolen her child and shattered her Khalasar. The Khalasar had scattered into the desert. Daenerys Targaryen, the last surviving public claim of the House of the Dragon, had hit the absolute bottom of her exile. She was alone in a hostile land with nothing but 3 stones and the memory of a life that had never existed. And it was from this absolute bottom that the old Targaryen philosophy reasserted itself with the force of a prophecy fulfilled: fire and blood. The only solution her bloodline had ever truly trusted when hope was gone. Daenerys made a choice that no sane person would make, and here lay the secret of her blood. The Targaryens were never entirely sane by ordinary standards. They were dragon riders, and their minds worked differently. She ordered a pyre built for the body of Khal Drogo, and on that pyre she placed the 3 petrified dragon eggs, the last remnants of her stolen birthright, objects that scholars across the known world had declared to be worthless stone, relics, dead things. But Daenerys Targaryen understood something in that moment that the Maesters of Westeros had long forgotten or deliberately suppressed. The Targaryen connection to magic was never truly dead. It was only dormant. It was waiting for the right sacrifice to wake it, and a blood sacrifice needed blood. 3 deaths fueled that fire: the body of her husband, the stallion who would never mount the world, the life of Mirri Maz Duur, the Maegi who had betrayed her trust and murdered her unborn child, and the life of Daenerys Targaryen herself, the blood of old Valyria, the blood of the dragon. She walked into the flames as the fire consumed the pyre, surrendering herself to the furnace that had defined her family for generations. When the dawn came, the ashes of the Red Waste bore witness to a miracle that shattered the modern understanding of the world. Daenerys Targaryen emerged from the dying embers, naked, unburnt, untouched by the fire that had consumed everything around her. Clinging to her skin were 3 newborn dragons, their scales wet from the egg, their cries piercing the silence of the desert. The world had just witnessed the first hatching of dragons in over 150 years. The blood sacrifice had worked. The fire had given birth to power, and the entire order of the world shifted on its axis. This was not merely the rebirth of a dynasty, it was the rebirth of magic itself, in a world that had grown comfortable in its absence. The birth of Daenerys' dragons sent an invisible shockwave across the known world. Red comets streaked the sky, interpreted by every culture as an omen. Warlocks in Karth felt their ancient powers surge. Pyromancers in King's Landing found their wildfire spells burning brighter and truer. Far north beyond the wall, the others stirred in their ancient slumber, as if the return of fire had woken the cold. Magic had been a half-forgotten myth for generations, slowly bleeding out of the world since the last Targaryen dragon had died. The Maesters of the Citadel had systematically worked to dismantle the supernatural, to replace wonder with reason. Standing before that pyre, Daenerys Targaryen crushed that entire worldview under the heel of her bare foot. The birth of those 3 creatures from stone proved that the Targaryen bloodline was the key that unlocked the supernatural world. The blood of the dragon was not a metaphor. It was a literal, physical conduit through which the old powers of Valyria flowed back into the world. The fire that burned inside Daenerys was the same fire that had forged the Valyrian Freehold, the same fire that had conquered the 7 kingdoms. It had never gone out. It had simply been waiting for a worthy channel. Blood of the dragon, the old texts called it, and the dragons themselves recognized it. This moment also sealed the cyclical fate of House Targaryen in a way that could not be undone. Their dynasty had been built on conquest, on the backs of dragons. It had fallen when the dragons died, torn apart by civil war, by the dance of the dragons, by the madness of kings who no longer had the fire to command obedience. Now the cycle was beginning again. The same fire that had forged the kingdom was rising from the ashes of exile. Daenerys named her children, Drogon for her fallen husband, Rhaegal for her murdered brother Rhaegar. The prince had died on the trident, Viserion, for her cruel brother Viserys, the beggar king who had sold their mother's crown for a promise. She wrapped the names of her past, her trauma, and her loss around her future. She turned the gusts of her family into weapons. From this point forward, there was no going back. The philosophy of fire and blood, which had destroyed her father Aerys II and gutted her family for generations, was now the only philosophy that could save her or destroy her. The Targaryens had always been bound to this loop. Rise with dragons, fall without them, rise again through fire and blood. Daenerys was not breaking the cycle. She was embracing it, fulfilling it, and repeating the oldest pattern of her ancestors. The girl who had dreamed of a red door and a lemon tree in a house that never truly stood in Braavos was gone. In her place stood the mother of dragons, a woman who understood that to be a Targaryen was to walk a path of fire, and that the only way to survive the flame was to be the flame itself. Looking back across the entire history of House Targaryen, from the doom of Valyria to the mad pyromania of Aerys II, to the bloody wars of succession and the extinction of the last true dragons, the birth of Daenerys' 3 dragons in the Red Waste is the single event that most perfectly encapsulates the family's entire identity. It is a moment of impossible beauty born from absolute horror. The death of a husband, the burning of a witch, the sacrifice of a child, and a woman walking willingly into a fire that should have consumed her bones. It is the purest expression of the Valyrian answer to a broken world. Burn it down and rise from the ashes. The old Valyrian blood does not break. It does not beg. It does not negotiate. It burns. And out of that burning, something new is always born. Whether a kingdom or a monster, that is the deepest secret of the last dragon's blood. It is a destructive force, a creative force, and a curse that binds the family to a cycle of ruin and resurrection for as long as their bloodline endures. The fire never truly goes out. It sleeps beneath the skin, dormant in the blood. And when the world least expects it, when the house of the dragon has been reduced to ashen memory, the fire wakes up, and the entire order of things burns to the ground, so that something new can crawl, bloody and screaming, from the cinders.